The Sabbat Worlds occupy a cluster of star systems in the rimward reaches of the Segmentum Pacificus, a region that has witnessed the ebb and flow of imperial authority across 10,000 years of human history. These worlds take their name from Saint Sabbat, one of the most venerated figures in the Imperial Creed, whose prophetic visions in the 34th millennium transformed a collection of disparate human colonies into a unified bastion of faith. The saint's pilgrimage through this region during that ancient age left an indelible mark on the local culture, establishing a tradition of fierce devotion to the emperor that would endure for millennia. Saint Sabbat's visions spoke of a realm where humanity would stand firm against the darkness, where the Imperial Creed would shine as a beacon in the void. The worlds she touched during her travels adopted her teachings with fervor, building great cathedrals and shrines in her honor. The ecclesiarchy recognized the strategic and spiritual significance of this cluster, designating it as the Sabbat Worlds and ensuring that substantial resources flowed into the region to maintain its defenses and religious infrastructure. For thousands of years, these worlds prospered as centers of trade, faith, and military strength, their populations proud of their heritage and their connection to the saint's legacy. The stability of the Sabbat Worlds began to fracture in the mid-41st millennium. Around the year 750 of the 41st millennium, Chaos forces under the command of Archon Erloch Gower launched a massive invasion from the regions beyond Imperial space. Gower, a warlord of immense cunning and cruelty, had spent decades consolidating power among the various Chaos-aligned forces in the galactic North Rimward, forging disparate warbands, traitor legions, and corrupted human populations into a unified military machine. His forces struck with devastating precision, targeting key worlds in the Sabbat Worlds cluster and exploiting weaknesses in the Imperial defenses that had grown complacent after centuries of relative peace. The initial assaults caught the Imperial authorities off guard. Gower's strategy relied on speed and overwhelming force, with his fleets emerging from the warp at multiple points simultaneously to prevent coordinated Imperial responses. World after world fell to his armies, their populations either slaughtered or enslaved to fuel the Archon's war machine. The planetary defense forces, while brave and well-trained by the standards of the Imperium, found themselves outmatched by the sheer ferocity and numbers of the invading forces. Chaos cultists who had infiltrated Imperial society over the preceding decades emerged to sabotage defenses from within, opening gates and disabling void shields at critical moments. The ecclesiarchy watched in horror as shrines built to honor Saint Sabbat were desecrated and transformed into blasphemous temples dedicated to the ruinous powers. The populations that had once exemplified Imperial faith were subjected to corruption and torment, their souls harvested to fuel demonic rituals. Within a handful of years, the majority of the Sabbat Worlds had fallen under Gower's dominion, and the Archon established his seat of power on the world of Balhaut, transforming it into a fortress from which he could coordinate his expanding domain. News of the catastrophe reached the Segmentum command structures with agonizing slowness, as is often the case with events occurring in the more distant reaches of Imperial space. The warp storms that plagued the region during this period further complicated communication, with astropathic messages taking months or even years to reach their destinations. By the time the full scope of the disaster became clear to the High Lords of Terra, Gower had already consolidated his hold on dozens of worlds and was pushing further into Imperial territory. The strategic implications of losing the Sabbat Worlds extended far beyond the immediate military concerns. The cluster occupied a position that threatened several major trade routes through the Segmentum Pacificus, and its loss created a dangerous salient in Imperial defenses that could serve as a launching point for further Chaos incursions. Additionally, the symbolic significance of allowing worlds blessed by a saint to remain under Chaos dominion posed an unacceptable threat to Imperial morale and the authority of the ecclesiarchy. Warmaster Slaydo, a veteran commander who had distinguished himself in campaigns across multiple sectors, recognized the urgency of the situation. Slaydo had built his reputation through methodical strategic planning combined with aggressive tactical execution, and he understood that the Sabbat Worlds could not be abandoned without severe consequences for the Imperium's position in the entire segmentum. In 755, he compiled a comprehensive assessment of the military situation in the region and presented it to the High Lords of Terra, along with a formal petition to launch a full-scale crusade to reconquer the Lost Worlds. Slaydo's petition detailed the forces that would be required for such an undertaking. The Sabbat Worlds represented a vast area of space containing over 100 inhabited systems, many of which now hosted substantial chaos military installations and corrupted populations. A conventional campaign to retake such a region would require resources on a scale that the Imperium rarely committed outside of the most dire circumstances. Slaydo argued that the strategic value of the region, combined with its religious significance, justified the enormous expenditure of men and materiel that would be necessary. The High Lords deliberated on Slaydo's petition for months, weighing the costs against other pressing military needs across the Imperium. The 41st Millennium had seen no shortage of threats requiring attention, from Orc-Waz to Tyrannid hive fleets to the ever-present menace of chaos incursions. However, the loss of the Sabbat Worlds represented a particularly egregious failure of imperial authority, and the ecclesiarchy exerted considerable pressure to ensure that the region would be reclaimed. Eventually, the High Lords granted their approval, and Slaydo received his commission as Warmaster of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade with authority to requisition whatever forces he deemed necessary for the campaign. The mustering of forces for the crusade began immediately. Slaydo sent out calls to dozens of Imperial Guard regiments across multiple sectors, requesting that they redirect their deployments to the staging grounds he had designated. Regiments from worlds as diverse as Tanith, Verghast, Vitria, and Belladin received orders to prepare for extended campaigning in the Sabbat Worlds. The Navy committed substantial battle groups to the effort, including battleships, cruisers, and the massive support fleets necessary to sustain a military operation of this magnitude across hostile space. The Adeptus Astartes, while never committing forces in the numbers that the Imperial Guard could muster, also pledged support to the crusade. Several chapters agreed to deploy strike forces or even full companies to participate in key operations. The Space Marines would prove invaluable in the most difficult assaults, their superhuman abilities and advanced equipment allowing them to crack defenses that conventional forces could not overcome. Balhaut, despite being under Chaos control, became the primary strategic objective for the early phases of the Crusade. Slaydo recognized that liberating this world would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, Balhaut's position made it an ideal staging ground for subsequent operations deeper into the Sabbat Worlds cluster. Symbolically, retaking the world that Gower had chosen as his capital would demonstrate imperial resolve and strike a significant blow against enemy morale. The logistics of assembling the Crusade forces required years of preparation. Millions of tons of supplies had to be transported to forward positions, including ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and the countless other necessities of sustained military operations. The Adeptus Munitorum worked ceaselessly to coordinate the movement of regiments from their home worlds to the designated assembly points, a task complicated by the vagaries of warp travel and the ongoing need to maintain security along the supply lines. Slaydo established his command structure during this preparatory phase, selecting officers and advisors who would help him prosecute the campaign. The Warmaster understood that a crusade of this scope would likely continue for decades, requiring not just military expertise, but also the ability to manage the complex political and administrative challenges that would inevitably arise. He surrounded himself with specialists in various aspects of warfare, from void combat to siege operations to counterinsurgency tactics. By the year 755 of the 41st Millennium, Warmaster Slaydo had assembled a military force that dwarfed most imperial campaigns of the era. Over 70 Imperial Guard regiments had answered his call, representing billions of soldiers drawn from across the Segmentum Pacificus and beyond. The fleet assets alone numbered in the thousands of vessels, from massive battleships capable of reducing worlds to cinders to the humble transports that would ferry troops between combat zones. This concentration of military power represented one of the largest mobilizations the Imperium had undertaken in centuries, and Slaydo intended to use every asset at his disposal to maximum effect. The Warmaster's strategic philosophy centered on aggressive momentum rather than cautious consolidation. Where other commanders might have advocated for a methodical world-by-world liberation, Slaydo recognized that such an approach would allow Archon Gower time to fortify his positions and coordinate effective resistance. Instead, Slaydo planned to strike at multiple system clusters simultaneously, forcing the Chaos forces to divide their attention and resources across numerous fronts. This strategy carried significant risks, as it would stretch Imperial supply lines and leave liberated worlds potentially vulnerable to counterattack. But Slaydo calculated that the speed of advance would compensate for these vulnerabilities by keeping the enemy perpetually off balance. The initial assaults began with coordinated strikes against the outer systems of the Sabbat Worlds cluster. Imperial Navy battle groups emerged from the warp at predetermined coordinates, their guns already tracking targets as they transitioned back into real space. The Chaos forces, accustomed to years of relative security in their conquered territories, found themselves suddenly fighting defensive actions across dozens of systems. Slaydo's plan deliberately targeted systems with minimal defensive installations first, allowing the Crusade forces to rack up quick victories that would boost morale and establish forward operating bases for subsequent operations. The liberation of the Forge world Urdesh marked a crucial turning point in the early Crusade. Urdesh had been one of the first major industrial worlds to fall to Gower's invasion, and the Archon had been quick to recognize its value. The Forge world's manufactoria had been corrupted and repurposed to produce weapons and ammunition for Chaos forces, their output sustained by slave labor drawn from the surrounding systems. The Adeptus Mechanicus had declared Urdesh lost and had written off its considerable assets, but Slaydo understood that reclaiming the Forge world would provide the Crusade with desperately needed production capacity. The assault on Urdesh required careful planning. The world's defenses included extensive orbital fortifications, ground-based anti-aircraft batteries, and substantial garrison forces that had been reinforced after the initial conquest. Slaydo committed 3 full Imperial Guard armies to the operation, supported by significant Navy assets and a strike force from the Silver Guard Space Marine chapter. The initial Void battle lasted for weeks as Imperial ships systematically destroyed the orbital platforms and cleared approach vectors for the ground assault. The landing operations on Urdesh demonstrated the brutal efficiency that would characterize Slaydo's campaigns throughout the Crusade. Rather than attempting to land forces at a single beachhead, the Warmaster ordered simultaneous drops at 7 different locations across the planet's surface. This dispersed the defending forces and prevented them from concentrating their strength against any single Imperial thrust. The fighting that followed consumed months of grinding urban warfare through the Forge world's industrial complexes, with both sides suffering catastrophic casualties as they battled for control of individual manufactoria and hab blocks. The reclamation of Urdesh's production facilities proved more challenging than anticipated. The Chaos forces had not simply occupied the Forge world's infrastructure, but had actively corrupted it through demonic rituals and the introduction of warp-tainted materials into the manufacturing processes. Tech priests from the Adeptus Mechanicus spent years after the liberation performing purification rites and rebuilding entire production lines that had been deemed too contaminated to salvage. Nevertheless, even the partial restoration of Urdesh's industrial capacity provided the Crusade with a significant strategic advantage, allowing for the local production of ammunition, vehicles, and other essential supplies that would otherwise have needed to be transported across vast distances. Slaydo used the momentum from the Urdesh victory to push deeper into enemy-held territory. His forces moved in broad sweeps across the Sabbat Worlds cluster, liberating systems in rapid succession. The Warmaster established a network of forward supply bases on newly liberated worlds, creating logistics hubs that could support operations further from the Crusade's initial staging areas. These bases required substantial garrison forces to defend against potential counterattacks, but they proved essential to maintaining the aggressive pace of operations that Slaydo demanded. The Siege of Morland in 759 tested the Crusade forces in ways that the earlier campaigns had not. Morland occupied a strategic position along one of the major warp routes through the Sabbat Worlds, and Gower had transformed it into a fortress world bristling with defensive installations. The planet's surface featured extensive trench networks, bunker complexes, and void shield generators that protected key facilities from orbital bombardment. Intelligence reports indicated that the garrison numbered in the millions, including substantial contingents of the Blood Pact, one of the most fanatical and well-trained Chaos military organizations operating under Gower's command. The Blood Pact represented a different caliber of enemy than the cultist rabble and corrupted planetary defense forces that had opposed many of the earlier Imperial assaults. These warriors had been recruited from populations that had lived under Chaos dominion for years, their indoctrination complete and their combat training rigorous. They wore distinctive crimson armor and fought with a discipline that rivaled Imperial Guard regiments, making them formidable opponents in both defensive and offensive operations. The Blood Pact's presence at Morland signaled that Gower considered the world's defense a priority and had committed elite forces to ensure it would not fall easily. Slaydo recognized that a conventional assault on Morland would result in unacceptable casualties, potentially stalling the Crusade's momentum for years. Instead, he devised a strategy that combined sustained orbital bombardment with targeted ground operations aimed at neutralizing the planet's void shields. The bombardment lasted for months, with Navy vessels maintaining a constant barrage against identified defensive positions. Meanwhile, Special Forces units from several regiments, including the Tanith First and elements of the Vitrian Dragoons, conducted raids behind enemy lines to sabotage shield generators and ammunition depots. The breakthrough at Morland came when Imperial forces managed to capture and hold a section of the defensive perimeter long enough to land heavy armor and artillery. The tanks and guns poured through the gap, expanding the breach and allowing additional forces to deploy. The fighting devolved into a brutal slugging match as Imperial and Chaos forces contested every meter of ground. The Blood Pact fought with suicidal determination, launching counterattacks even when their positions became untenable and refusing to surrender under any circumstances. The siege consumed nearly a full year before Imperial forces finally secured the planet, and the casualty figures on both sides reached into the hundreds of thousands. Throughout these campaigns, Slaydo demonstrated a willingness to accept heavy losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. His critics, of which there were many among the Crusade's officer corps, argued that the Warmaster's aggressive tactics needlessly expended lives that could have been preserved through more cautious approaches. Slaydo's supporters countered that the speed of advance prevented Gower from establishing effective defensive lines, and that the momentum of continuous victories maintained morale among the Imperial forces. The debate would continue throughout the Crusade and beyond, with military historians analyzing Slaydo's decisions for generations afterward. The Warmaster's campaigns against other Chaos forces in the region revealed the diverse nature of the enemy. Beyond the Blood Pact, Imperial forces encountered numerous other Chaos-aligned organizations, each with their own methods and motivations. Some worlds were held by corrupted Imperial Guard regiments that had turned traitor during the initial invasion, their knowledge of Imperial tactics making them particularly dangerous opponents. Other systems hosted demonic cults whose members had been transformed by warp exposure into something barely recognizable as human. The variety of enemies required Imperial commanders to remain flexible in their tactical approaches, as strategies that worked against one type of foe often proved ineffective against another. By 765, the Crusade had liberated dozens of systems and was preparing for what many believed would be the decisive operation of the entire campaign, the assault on Balhaut. The world remained Gower's capital and the symbolic heart of his empire in the Sabbat Worlds. Intelligence suggested that the Archon had concentrated significant forces there, anticipating that the Imperials would eventually move against his seat of power. Slaydo committed massive resources to the operation, assembling the largest invasion force the Crusade had yet deployed. The Battle of Balhaut exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions in terms of its scale and ferocity. The fighting raged across the planet's surface for months, with both sides feeding reinforcements into the meat grinder as they struggled for control of key positions. Slaydo personally directed operations from a forward command post, refusing to remain safely aboard a command ship in orbit. The Warmaster's presence on the battlefield inspired the Imperial forces, but also exposed him to considerable danger. During the final push to capture Balhaut's primary hive city, Slaydo led an assault force that broke through the outer defenses and penetrated deep into enemy-held territory. The fighting in the hive's corridors and chambers was savage, with combatants often engaging at point-blank range in conditions where heavy weapons and vehicles could not be effectively deployed. Slaydo himself fought in the front ranks, his example driving his soldiers forward even as casualties mounted. It was during this assault that the Warmaster received the wounds that would ultimately prove fatal. Despite immediate medical attention, Slaydo's injuries were too severe, and he died within hours of being evacuated from the front lines. The loss of Slaydo at the moment of victory at Balhaut created an immediate crisis of command. The Warmaster had not formally designated a successor, though he had clearly favored certain generals within his inner circle. Two officers emerged as the primary candidates to assume command of the Crusade: General Barthol van Voits, known as Macaroth after his home world, and General Lugo Bulledin. Both men had distinguished themselves throughout the Slaydo years, commanding major operations and demonstrating the strategic acumen necessary to prosecute a campaign of this magnitude. Macaroth had built his reputation through careful planning and an emphasis on minimizing casualties where possible. His campaigns had been characterized by thorough reconnaissance, extensive preparation, and a preference for outmaneuvering enemies rather than engaging in direct confrontation when alternatives existed. Macaroth's approach appealed to those officers who believed that Slaydo's aggressive tactics had been too costly and that a more measured strategy would better serve the Crusade's long-term objectives. Bulledin represented a continuation of Slaydo's philosophy. He advocated for maintaining the aggressive momentum that had characterized the past 10 years, arguing that any pause would allow Gower to rebuild his forces and fortify his remaining holdings. Bulledin's supporters pointed to the undeniable successes of Slaydo's approach and warned that changing strategies mid-campaign risked squandering the gains that had been purchased with so much blood. The succession crisis threatened to paralyze the Crusade at a critical juncture. Officers aligned themselves with one candidate or the other, and tensions within the command structure rose as both camps maneuvered for advantage. The resolution came through intervention from the highest levels of Imperial authority. After reviewing reports from both candidates and consulting with various advisors, the decision was made to appoint Macaroth as the new Warmaster. The official announcement emphasized Macaroth's proven record and his vision for the next phase of the Crusade, though it stopped short of explicitly criticizing Bulledin or his approach. The announcement of Macaroth's appointment as Warmaster did not immediately resolve the tensions within the Crusade command structure. While the decision carried the weight of Imperial authority, it could not erase the deep divisions that had formed during the succession crisis. Bulledin's supporters, many of whom had served under Slaydo since the earliest days of the Crusade, viewed the selection as a rejection of everything their fallen commander had achieved. They feared that Macaroth would abandon the aggressive strategy that had brought the Crusade to the very heart of Gower's domain, potentially allowing the Archon time to rebuild his shattered forces and transform the campaign into a protracted stalemate. Lord General Barthol van Voits, despite his elevation to the position of Warmaster, understood that his authority remained fragile during these initial months. He had not been Slaydo's explicit choice, and many officers questioned whether he possessed the necessary qualities to lead such a massive military undertaking. Macaroth needed allies within the command structure who could help him consolidate power and implement his vision for the Crusade's future direction. The most crucial of these allies was Lord General Barthol van Voits, who shared Macaroth's surname but came from a different branch of the same noble house on their home world. Van Voits had commanded the 50th Army Group during the Slaydo years, distinguishing himself through competent leadership and an ability to navigate the complex political dynamics that inevitably arose when dozens of Imperial Guard regiments operated in close proximity. Unlike many officers who focused exclusively on military matters, Van Voits possessed a sophisticated understanding of the administrative and logistical frameworks that sustained Crusade-scale operations. He recognized that the Sabbat Worlds Crusade required not just battlefield victories, but also the establishment of stable governance structures on liberated worlds, the maintenance of supply lines across vast distances, and the careful management of relationships between different imperial organizations operating in the region. Macaroth appointed Van Voits as his second-in-command and tasked him with overseeing the reorganization of the Crusade's command structure. The system that had evolved under Slaydo had been largely informal, with the Warmaster maintaining direct control over most major decisions and delegating authority on an ad hoc basis, depending on the circumstances of individual campaigns. This approach had worked well enough when Slaydo's personal charisma and proven track record ensured that his orders would be followed without question, but it left the command hierarchy poorly defined and vulnerable to the kind of succession crisis that had just occurred. Van Voits spent weeks analyzing the existing command arrangements and consulting with officers from various regiments and army groups. He identified numerous inefficiencies and points of confusion where overlapping authorities or unclear chains of command had created problems during past operations. The solution he proposed to Macaroth involved establishing a formal Crusade high command structure that would clearly delineate responsibilities and create multiple layers of authority beneath the Warmaster himself. This system would reduce the burden on Macaroth by distributing decision-making authority to trusted subordinates while maintaining overall strategic coherence. The establishment of the Crusade High Command at Balhaut represented a significant shift in how the campaign would be prosecuted going forward. Macaroth selected Balhaut as the headquarters location both for its strategic position and for its symbolic significance as the former capital of Gaur's domain. The world had suffered tremendous damage during its liberation, with entire sections of its primary, Hive city reduced to rubble by the fighting. Imperial engineers and reconstruction crews worked continuously to restore basic functionality to the city's infrastructure, while simultaneously establishing the facilities necessary to support Crusade command operations. The High Command Complex eventually occupied a fortified section of the Upper Hive, its walls reinforced with ferrocrete and its approaches guarded by multiple regiments dedicated to security duties. Within the complex, Macaroth and Van Voits assembled a staff that numbered in the thousands, including strategic planners, intelligence analysts, logistics coordinators, and representatives from the various imperial organizations participating in the crusade. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintained a permanent delegation to coordinate the restoration and operation of industrial facilities on liberated worlds. The Ecclesiarchy assigned high-ranking clerics to advise on matters related to the spiritual reconquest of the Sabbat Worlds and the purification of populations that had been exposed to chaos corruption. The organizational structure that emerged from these efforts divided the crusade into multiple theater commands, each responsible for operations within a designated region of the Sabbat Worlds cluster. Theater commanders received broad authority to plan and execute campaigns within their areas of responsibility, though major strategic decisions still required approval from the High Command. This arrangement allowed for greater operational flexibility than Slaydo's centralized approach, while maintaining overall coordination between different fronts. Macaroth's strategic doctrine differed fundamentally from his predecessor's aggressive expansion philosophy, where Slaydo had prioritized rapid advances and the liberation of as many worlds as possible in the shortest time frame. Macaroth emphasized consolidation and the establishment of secure rear areas. He argued that the Crusade had overextended itself during the Slaydo years, liberating worlds without ensuring they could be adequately defended or governed. This had created a patchwork of imperial control across the Sabbat Worlds, with many recently liberated systems remaining vulnerable to chaos counterattacks or internal insurgencies. The new Warmaster ordered a comprehensive review of every world that had been brought back under imperial authority during the previous decade. The reports that came back confirmed his concerns. Dozens of worlds that had been officially declared liberated still hosted active chaos cult cells or remnant enemy military forces that continued to resist imperial authority. Garrison forces on many of these worlds were stretched thin, barely sufficient to maintain control over major population centers while leaving vast rural areas effectively ungoverned. Supply lines remained precarious, with convoy routes frequently targeted by raiders operating from systems that the Crusade had bypassed in its rush to reach Balhaut. Macaroth's response to these problems involved redirecting significant resources toward stabilization operations rather than new conquests. He assigned entire army groups to anti-insurgency campaigns on worlds that had supposedly been secured years earlier. These operations often proved frustrating for the imperial forces involved, as they required different tactics and mindsets than conventional warfare against organized enemy armies. Rooting out cult cells embedded within civilian populations demanded extensive intelligence work, careful coordination with local authorities, and a willingness to accept that complete victory might take years or even decades to achieve. The shift in strategic priorities generated considerable controversy within the Crusade command structure. Officers who had served under Slaydo and internalized his aggressive philosophy viewed Macaroth's consolidation approach as timid and overly cautious. They argued that the momentum of continuous advances had kept Gower off balance and prevented him from organizing effective resistance, while pausing to secure rear areas would give the Archon exactly what he needed most: time. These critics pointed out that Chaos forces still controlled significant portions of the Sabbat Worlds cluster, including several major industrial worlds and critical strategic positions. Allowing these enemy strongholds to remain unmolested while Imperial forces conducted pacification operations seemed to abandon the initiative that Slaydo had fought so hard to establish. General Bulletin emerged as the most prominent voice of opposition to Macaroth's new direction. Despite having lost the succession struggle, Bulletin retained command of a substantial army group and continued to wield considerable influence among officers who shared his views. He made no secret of his disagreements with the Warmaster's policies, arguing in staff meetings and official reports that the Crusade was squandering the advantages gained during the Slaydo years. Bulletin advocated for resuming offensive operations against the remaining Chaos-held worlds, particularly targeting the industrial centers that continued to supply Gower's forces with weapons and equipment. The tension between Macaroth and the Bulletin loyalist faction created a persistent undercurrent of discord within the High Command. Van Voigt spent considerable effort managing these tensions, attempting to find compromises that would satisfy both the Warmaster's strategic vision and the concerns of officers who feared that consolidation would lead to stagnation. He arranged for some offensive operations to continue, targeting specific enemy positions that posed immediate threats to Imperial-held territory, while ensuring that the bulk of Crusade resources remained focused on stabilization efforts as Macaroth had directed. The integration of newly arrived Imperial Guard regiments presented additional challenges for the reorganized command structure. The Crusade's early successes and the symbolic significance of liberating the Sabbat worlds had attracted attention across the Imperium, leading to offers of reinforcements from sectors that had not originally contributed forces to the campaign. These new arrivals brought fresh manpower and equipment that the Crusade desperately needed after a decade of sustained combat operations, but they also introduced complications in terms of command relationships and operational integration. Many of the newly arrived regiments had no experience working within the existing Crusade framework. Their officers were unfamiliar with the tactical doctrines that had evolved during the Slaydo years, and their troops lacked the hard-won knowledge of fighting chaos forces in the unique conditions of the Sabbat Worlds. The veteran regiments that had participated in the campaign from its earliest days often viewed the newcomers with suspicion, questioning whether they possessed the necessary commitment and capability to contribute meaningfully to the war effort. These tensions occasionally erupted into open conflicts between units, requiring intervention from higher command authorities to resolve. Macaroth tasked Van Voigts with developing integration protocols for new regiments joining the Crusade. These protocols included mandatory orientation periods during which newly arrived units would be paired with veteran formations for joint training exercises and limited combat operations. The goal was to transfer tactical knowledge and establish working relationships before the new regiments were assigned to independent operations. This approach consumed time and resources that could have been devoted to combat operations, but both Macaroth and Van Voigts considered it essential for maintaining the overall effectiveness of Crusade forces. The administrative burden of managing hundreds of regiments from dozens of different worlds required the High Command to establish extensive bureaucratic systems. The Adeptus Munitorum maintained a massive presence at Balhaut, with thousands of scribes and administrators working to track unit strengths, equipment inventories, supply requirements, and countless other details necessary for coordinating such a large military force. The Munitorum's representatives frequently clashed with military commanders over resource allocation decisions, as the administrators prioritized efficiency and standardization, while field officers demanded flexibility to address the specific circumstances of their operations. Macaroth's relationship with the Adeptus Astartes, forces operating within the Crusade theater, proved more straightforward than his dealings with Imperial Guard commanders. The Space Marines maintained their traditional independence, coordinating with Crusade Command when their objectives aligned, but pursuing their own operations when they identified targets that suited their capabilities. The Warmaster understood and accepted these arrangements, recognizing that attempting to exert direct authority over Astartes' forces would likely prove counterproductive. Instead, he focused on ensuring that Space Marine operations complemented the broader Crusade strategy, requesting their intervention in situations where their unique abilities would prove decisive. The Navy component of the Crusade required careful attention as well. Fleet operations had consumed enormous resources during the Slaydo years, with constant combat operations taking a toll on ships and crews. Macaroth authorized extended refit periods for vessels that had been in continuous service since the campaign's beginning, accepting the temporary reduction in available fleet strength in exchange for ensuring that the Navy could sustain operations over the long term. This decision generated complaints from some quarters, particularly officers who wanted to launch immediate offensives against enemy-held systems, but the Warmaster remained firm in his conviction that maintaining the fleet's overall health was essential for the Crusade's ultimate success. The military forces that opposed the Sabbat Worlds Crusade represented one of the most formidable concentrations of chaos power assembled in the Segmentum Pacificus during the 41st Millennium. At the apex of this war machine stood Archon Erlock Gower, a figure whose strategic genius and ruthless ambition had transformed disparate warbands and corrupted populations into a unified military apparatus capable of conquering and holding dozens of star systems. Gower's command structure differed fundamentally from the chaotic rabble that characterized many chaos invasions, instead employing rigid hierarchies, clear chains of command, and sophisticated logistical systems that allowed his forces to sustain prolonged campaigns against Imperial opposition. Gower himself remained an enigmatic figure throughout much of the Crusade. Imperial intelligence agencies devoted substantial resources to gathering information about the Archon, but concrete details about his origins and the source of his authority proved frustratingly elusive. What was known with certainty was that Gower commanded absolute loyalty from his subordinate commanders through a combination of military success, brutal enforcement of discipline, and the dark blessings of the ruinous powers. The Archon maintained his headquarters on Balhaut during the early years of his occupation, transforming the world into a fortress from which he coordinated operations across the entire Sabbat Worlds cluster. The command structure beneath Gower consisted of multiple tiers of subordinate commanders, each responsible for specific regions or military formations. These officers bore titles that mimicked imperial military ranks, though their actual authority and responsibilities often differed significantly from their imperial counterparts. The most senior of these commanders, known as Gower's Anaquaner or Iron Circle, wielded power comparable to imperial sector commanders, directing the operations of multiple army groups and maintaining their own staffs and logistics networks. Below them, a hierarchy of lesser commanders oversaw individual armies, divisions, and regiments, creating a pyramid of authority that allowed Gower to exercise control over forces numbering in the hundreds of millions. This organizational sophistication extended to the logistics and supply systems that sustained Gower's military machine. The Archon recognized that conquest alone was insufficient. Holding territory required establishing functional governance structures and maintaining the industrial capacity to equip and supply his armies. On worlds that fell under his control, Gower's administrators implemented systems for extracting resources, conscripting labor, and coordinating production across multiple planets. Forge facilities on captured industrial worlds were converted to produce weapons and ammunition according to standardized patterns, allowing for interoperability between different units and simplifying supply operations. This approach stood in stark contrast to the typical Chaos Warband, which relied on scavenged equipment and ad hoc supply arrangements. The Blood Pact represented the most elite and feared of the military formations operating under Gower's command. This organization functioned as both an army and a religious order, its members bound to the Archon and to the blood god Khorne through elaborate blood-binding rituals that sealed their loyalty in ways that went beyond mere oaths or indoctrination. Recruitment into the Blood Pact began with the identification of suitable candidates from populations living under Gower's rule. The selection criteria emphasized physical capability and mental resilience, as the training regimen that followed would break those who lacked the necessary attributes. Candidates who survived the initial selection underwent months of brutal training that combined military instruction with religious indoctrination. They learned to handle a variety of weapons, from las guns and auto guns to heavier equipment like mortars and anti-tank weapons. Physical conditioning pushed recruits to their limits and beyond, with those who failed often dying from exhaustion or injury. Throughout this process, Blood Pact instructors emphasized the glory of service to Khorne and the honor of dying in battle for the blood god. The training culminated in the blood binding ceremony itself, a ritual that involved the shedding of blood and the speaking of oaths that tied the recruit's soul to Khorne and to Gower as the blood god's chosen instrument in the Sabbat Worlds. The blood binding created warriors who fought with a ferocity that terrified even veteran Imperial Guard regiments. Blood Pact soldiers demonstrated a complete disregard for their own survival, launching attacks that would seem suicidal to conventional military thinking, yet somehow maintaining enough tactical discipline to make these assaults devastatingly effective. They wore distinctive crimson armor that marked them as Khorne's chosen, the color achieved through a combination of dyes and the literal blood of their enemies. Their helmets featured brass trim and skull motifs, creating an appearance that was both martial and deeply unsettling to those who faced them in combat. Despite their fanatical devotion to Khorne, the Blood Pact did not simply charge mindlessly at their enemies, as many Khornate cultists did. Their tactical doctrine emphasized disciplined assault formations that combined firepower with aggressive close combat capabilities. Blood Pact units advanced under covering fire from support weapons, using terrain and suppression to close with enemy positions before launching devastating melee attacks. They employed combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry assaults with armor support and artillery bombardment. This combination of religious fervor and military professionalism made them far more dangerous than typical chaos cultists, as they possessed both the will to fight to the death and the training to do so effectively. The organization of blood-pact formations mirrored Imperial Guard structures in many respects, with units organized into squads, platoons, companies, and regiments. Each level of organization had designated commanders who bore responsibility for their unit's performance and maintained discipline through a combination of leadership and brutal enforcement. Blood-pact officers wore additional decorations that marked their rank, including brass skull badges and elaborate shoulder guards. These officers had typically proven themselves through years of service and multiple campaigns, earning their positions through demonstrated capability rather than political connections or noble birth. Blood-pact regiments specialized in different forms of warfare depending on their training and equipment. Some functioned as line infantry, holding defensive positions or conducting sustained assaults against fortified objectives. Others served as shock troops, equipped with specialized weapons and trained to break through enemy defenses at critical points. Still others operated as raiders, conducting fast-moving operations behind enemy lines to disrupt supply convoys and assassinate Imperial commanders. This variety of capabilities allowed blood-pact forces to adapt to different tactical situations and made them difficult for Imperial forces to predict or counter. The equipment used by blood-pact warriors reflected their status as elite troops within Gaur's military hierarchy. While they carried lasguns and autoguns similar to those used by Imperial Guard regiments, these weapons were often of higher quality than the mass-produced arms issued to lesser Chaos forces. Blood-pact armories also included significant numbers of specialized weapons like plasma guns, meltaguns, and heavy bolters, distributed more liberally than would be typical in standard Imperial Guard formations. Their armor, while not approaching the protection offered by Space Marine power armor, provided better coverage and stopping power than the flak armor worn by most Imperial Guardsmen. Beyond the Blood Pact, Gaur's forces included numerous other military formations of varying quality and capability. Traitor militia units drawn from conquered populations provided garrison forces and supplementary combat power for major operations. These militias ranged from reasonably well-trained planetary defense forces that had turned traitor during the initial invasion to hastily assembled conscript units with minimal equipment and training. The quality of militia formations varied enormously depending on their origin and the resources available for their equipment and training, making them unpredictable elements on the battlefield. Some of the most effective non-blood-pact forces in Gaur's military came from Imperial Guard regiments that had defected to Chaos during or after the initial conquest. These traitor regiments retained their original organization and training, making them tactically competent opponents who understood Imperial doctrine and could anticipate how Loyalist forces would respond to different situations. They fought with a combination of military professionalism and the enhanced capabilities granted by Chaos corruption, creating enemies that were both familiar and alien to the Imperial forces they faced. The presence of these traitor regiments on the battlefield often had psychological effects beyond their actual combat contribution, as Loyalist guardsmen found themselves fighting opponents who wore corrupted versions of Imperial uniforms and used tactics they recognized from their own training. The Sons of Sek emerged as a major military force only after Gaur's death at Balhaut, though their origins traced back to the earlier years of the occupation. Anaquener Sek had served as one of Gaur's most trusted subordinates, commanding significant forces and demonstrating both tactical skill and political acumen. Following the Archon's death, Sek moved quickly to consolidate power, claiming authority over substantial portions of the remaining Chaos-held territory and establishing himself as Gaur's successor. The forces loyal to Sek became known as the Sons of Sek, distinguishing themselves from the Blood Pact through different uniforms and iconography, while maintaining similar levels of training and fanaticism. The Sons of Sek wore armor in dark colors rather than the crimson of the Blood Pact, with their helmets and equipment decorated with different symbols that reflected Sek's personal iconography rather than direct devotion to Khorne. This distinction marked more than mere aesthetics. It represented a shift in religious focus and organizational culture. While the Blood Pact served Khorne directly through their blood-binding rituals, the Sons of Sek pledged their loyalty primarily to Anaquenor Sek himself, viewing him as a figure worthy of veneration in his own right. This difference in orientation created tensions between the two organizations, with Blood Pact commanders often refusing to acknowledge Sek's authority and continuing to operate according to what they claimed were Gower's original intentions. The military capabilities of the Sons of Sek roughly matched those of the Blood Pact, as many of their initial recruits came from the same training systems and shared similar combat experience. Sek's forces employed comparable tactical doctrines, emphasizing aggressive assault operations supported by combined arms coordination. However, the Sons of Sek developed certain distinctive characteristics as their organization matured. They placed greater emphasis on infiltration and subversion operations, with specialized units trained to operate behind enemy lines for extended periods. These infiltrators gathered intelligence, sabotaged Imperial facilities, and coordinated with Chaos cult cells on Imperial-held worlds to prepare for future offensive operations. The Locksaddle represented an entirely different category of threat within Gower's military forces. These Xenos mercenaries came from beyond the Sabbat Worlds, their exact origin remaining uncertain to Imperial xenobiologists who studied captured specimens. Locksaddle stood roughly man-sized but possessed reptilian features, with scaled skin that provided natural armor and remarkable agility that allowed them to navigate difficult terrain with ease. They fought as skirmishers and raiders, using advanced energy weapons that were superior to most Imperial small arms. The distinctive crackling discharge of Locksaddle weapons became a feared sound on battlefields across the Sabbat Worlds, as these weapons could punch through standard flak armor with ease. Gower employed Locksaddle mercenary bands as specialists for operations requiring speed and precision rather than raw combat power. They excelled at ambush tactics, using their natural agility to occupy positions that human troops would find difficult or impossible to reach. Locksaddle bands often operated independently of larger chaos formations, conducting raids against Imperial supply lines or assassinating key personnel before disappearing into wilderness areas where pursuit proved difficult. Their alien nature made them immune to many of the psychological warfare techniques that Imperial forces used against human chaos cultists, as they possessed no cultural connection to the Imperium and felt no conflict about fighting against humanity. The relationship between Gower's forces and the Locksaddle remained purely mercenary, based on payment and the promise of plunder rather than any ideological alignment with chaos. The Locksaddle showed no signs of chaos corruption and appeared to worship their own alien gods rather than the ruinous powers. This pragmatic arrangement suited both parties. The Locksaddle received payment in the form of weapons, supplies, and permission to loot conquered territories, while Gower gained access to capable specialists who could perform missions that his human troops were ill-suited to undertake. The presence of Xenos mercenaries fighting alongside Chaos forces added another layer of complexity to the conflict, as it demonstrated Gower's willingness to ally with any force that could contribute to his military objectives, regardless of ideological purity. Demonic manifestations represented the most terrifying aspect of Chaos military power in the Sabbat Worlds. The warp storms and widespread chaos corruption that permeated the occupied territories created conditions where the barrier between real space and the warp grew thin, allowing demons to cross into the material universe more easily than in regions where Imperial authority remained strong. These manifestations ranged from minor warp entities that could be banished by concentrated firepower to greater demons whose presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of entire campaigns. The appearance of demons struck terror into Imperial forces, as these entities defied natural law and possessed capabilities that no amount of conventional military training could prepare soldiers to face. Chaos sorcerers served as crucial assets within Gower's military structure, using their psychic abilities and knowledge of warp rituals to support military operations in ways that conventional forces could not match. These sorcerers came from various backgrounds, Some were former Imperial psychers who had turned to chaos, while others had been trained in the dark arts from childhood within populations that had lived under chaos dominion for generations. They wielded powers that could kill with a thought, summon demons to the battlefield, or corrupt the minds of enemy soldiers from a distance. The presence of sorcerers within chaos formations forced Imperial commanders to develop counter-psyker tactics, typically involving the deployment of sanctioned psychers or specialized anti-psyker equipment when available. The integration of sorceress support into conventional military operations gave chaos forces capabilities that Imperial armies struggled to counter. Sorcerers could provide intelligence through scrying and divination, identifying Imperial troop movements and defensive positions before attacks were launched. During battles, they unleashed devastating psychic attacks that could destroy vehicles, collapse fortifications, or break the morale of entire units through waves of supernatural terror. The most powerful sorcerers maintained their own retinues and operated with considerable independence, pursuing their own arcane agendas while nominally serving Gower's strategic objectives. The world of Tanith fell to chaos forces in the opening months of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, though its destruction occurred not through prolonged siege or gradual corruption, but through catastrophic orbital bombardment that transformed the forested planet into a burning wasteland within hours. The attack came without warning, as chaos warships emerged from the warp and immediately opened fire on the planet's surface, their weapons targeting population centers and military installations with methodical precision. Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt had been on Tanith to oversee the founding of a new Imperial Guard regiment, a task that involved selecting suitable recruits from the planet's population and establishing the training infrastructure necessary to transform civilians into soldiers capable of serving the Emperor across the galaxy. The bombardment began while Gaunt was conducting final inspections of the assembled recruits at a mustering ground located several kilometers from Tanith's primary settlement. The first indication of the attack came as massive explosions lit the horizon, followed by the distinctive roar of orbital strikes tearing through the atmosphere. Gaunt immediately recognized the situation for what it was and understood that evacuation represented the only chance of survival for anyone on the planet's surface. The transport ships that had been designated to carry the newly founded regiment offworld sat on landing pads at the mustering ground, their crews scrambling to prepare for emergency departure as debris from the bombardment began raining down across the region. The decision Gaunt faced in those chaotic minutes would define both his career and the identity of the regiment he was founding. Thousands of Tanith civilians were fleeing toward the mustering ground, seeking escape from the firestorm consuming their world. The transport ships had limited capacity, and every civilian taken aboard would mean one fewer soldier from the assembled regiment could evacuate. Gaunt made the calculation that a commissar is trained to make, prioritizing military necessity over humanitarian concerns. He ordered the transports loaded with the regiment's recruits and essential equipment, then gave the command to lift off before the civilian refugees could reach the landing pads. The ships departed Tanith's surface with their holds packed with approximately 3,000 men who would become the Tanith First-and-Only, the sole survivors of their world's destruction. The guilt and trauma of that decision permeated the regiment's culture from its inception. The men who escaped Tanith's destruction carried with them the knowledge that they had survived while their families, friends, and everyone else they had known perished in the flames. This survivor's burden created a unit cohesion that went beyond the normal bonds formed through shared military service. The Tanith First fought not just for the Emperor or the Imperium in abstract terms, but to give meaning to their survival and to avenge a world that existed now only in their memories. They called themselves Ghosts, a name that reflected both their origins as the remnants of a dead world and their preferred methods of warfare. The cultural traditions that the Tanith brought with them into Imperial service derived from their world's environment and history. Tanith had been a heavily forested planet where the majority of the population lived in settlements scattered throughout vast woodlands. The Tanith people had developed sophisticated woodcraft skills over generations, learning to move silently through dense forest, track prey or enemies across difficult terrain, and survive in wilderness conditions with minimal equipment. These skills translated directly into military capabilities that made the Tanith exceptional scouts and infiltrators. Where other Imperial Guard regiments might struggle to operate in forested or jungle environments, the Tanith moved through such terrain as naturally as if they were walking down paved streets. The straight silver warknives carried by every Tanith soldier represented the most visible symbol of their cultural heritage. These blades, called Nalwood knives after the silver-barked trees from which their handles had traditionally been made, measured roughly 30 centimeters in length, with straight, double-edged blades designed for both cutting and thrusting. Before Tanith's destruction, these knives had served as everyday tools and ceremonial objects, with many families passing down specific blades through generations. The knives that the evacuated soldiers carried with them became irreplaceable relics, as no new Nalwood could ever be harvested from their dead world. The Tanith treated these blades with reverence, maintaining them carefully and considering their loss or damage a profound dishonor. Combat doctrine for the Tanith first emphasized stealth, reconnaissance, and precision strikes rather than the grinding attritional warfare that characterized many Imperial Guard operations. Gaunt recognized his regiment's unique capabilities and worked to ensure they received assignments that played to their strengths. The Tanith operated most effectively when deployed ahead of main Imperial forces to gather intelligence, identify enemy positions, and eliminate key targets before conventional assaults began. Their ability to infiltrate enemy-held territory without detection made them invaluable for missions that would have been suicidal for standard line infantry regiments. The regiment's structure reflected its specialized role within the larger crusade, rather than organizing into the conventional company and platoon system used by most Imperial Guard formations. The Tanith first operated with greater flexibility, forming ad hoc teams sized appropriately for specific missions. A typical Tanith operation might involve a small squad moving independently through hostile territory for days or weeks, gathering intelligence and surviving on minimal supplies while avoiding detection. These teams maintained communication with regimental command through encrypted Vox channels when possible, but often operated with considerable autonomy when circumstances prevented regular contact. The first major engagement for the Tanith first came at Fortis Binary, a forge world that had fallen under chaos control during the initial invasion. Imperial forces had struggled to make progress against the world's defenders, who had fortified the industrial complexes and created defensive positions that conventional assaults failed to breach. Gaunt received orders to take his regiment behind enemy lines and identify weaknesses in the Chaos defensive network that could be exploited by follow-up attacks. The Tanith infiltrated through sections of the Forge World's industrial wasteland that other regiments had deemed impassable, using their woodcraft skills adapted to an urban environment to move unseen through ruins and derelict structures. The intelligence gathered by the Tanith scouts during the Fortis Binary operation proved crucial to the eventual Imperial victory. They identified gaps in the enemy sensor coverage, mapped patrol routes, and located ammunition depots and command bunkers that had not appeared on Imperial tactical maps. More importantly, a Tanith team led by Major Alim Ron succeeded in sabotaging a key void shield generator, creating a breach in the defenses that allowed Imperial artillery to target previously protected positions. The Fortis Binary campaign established the Tanith First's reputation as elite reconnaissance specialists and brought them to the attention of senior Crusade commanders who began requesting their services for difficult operations. The defense of Vervenhive represented a different type of challenge for the regiment. The Hive City had remained loyal to the Imperium during the initial Chaos invasion, but faced assault from a massive enemy force that threatened to overwhelm its defenses. The Tanith first deployed to Vervenhive as part of a larger Imperial relief force, arriving to find the city under siege and its defenders exhausted from months of constant fighting. The urban environment of the Hive presented terrain radically different from the forests of their lost homeworld, but the Tanith adapted their tactics to the new conditions, using their stealth capabilities to conduct raids against enemy positions in the Underhive and the ruins of the outer districts. During the Verghast siege, the Tanith demonstrated their ability to fight conventional engagements when necessary while maintaining their preference for unconventional approaches. They held defensive positions alongside line infantry from other regiments during major enemy assaults, proving that their specialization in reconnaissance did not mean they lacked the capability to stand and fight when required. However, their most significant contributions came during night operations, when Tanith teams slipped out of the city's defenses to attack enemy artillery positions, supply convoys, and command posts. These raids disrupted chaos offensive operations and bought time for Imperial reinforcements to arrive in sufficient strength to break the siege. The campaign on Munthax tested the regiment in yet another environment. The world consisted primarily of frozen tundra and ice fields, conditions that bore no resemblance to the forests of Tanith or the urban sprawl of Verghast. The Chaos forces occupying Munthax had established bases in fortified positions that took advantage of the harsh climate, calculating that Imperial forces would struggle to operate effectively in such conditions. The Tanith proved them wrong, adapting their fieldcraft skills to the Arctic environment with remarkable speed. They learned to move across ice fields without leaving obvious tracks, construct shelters from snow and ice that provided concealment from enemy patrols, and endure the brutal cold through techniques that combined their natural resilience with improvised solutions. Gaunt's leadership style shaped the regiment's development throughout these early campaigns. Unlike many commissars who maintained strict distance from the soldiers under their authority, Gaunt involved himself directly in the regiment's operations, often accompanying scouting teams on dangerous missions rather than directing operations from secure command posts. This hands-on approach earned him respect from the Tanith soldiers, who valued competence and shared hardship over rank and privilege. Gaunt's tactical decisions consistently demonstrated understanding of his regiment's capabilities and limitations, avoiding assignments that would have wasted their specialized skills while seeking opportunities where those skills could make decisive differences. The nickname Gaunt's Ghosts emerged organically from other Imperial forces operating alongside the Tanith First. Soldiers from conventional regiments noticed the Tanith's tendency to appear and disappear without warning, materializing from terrain that seemed incapable of concealing a full regiment before vanishing just as mysteriously. The name stuck, and the Tanith themselves adopted it with a certain grim pride. The ghost imagery resonated with their identity as survivors of a dead world, reinforcing their sense of being separate from other Imperial forces while simultaneously marking them as exceptional. The regiment's organization evolved through experience as Gaunt, and his officers identified what worked and what did not. Veteran soldiers who demonstrated particular aptitude for scouting and infiltration received additional training and formed the core of specialized reconnaissance teams. These veterans mentored newer recruits, passing on the skills and knowledge necessary for survival in the dangerous missions the regiment regularly undertook. The Tanith developed their own tactical language, using terms and concepts derived from their homeworld's hunting traditions to describe military situations and maneuvers. This specialized vocabulary helped maintain their cultural identity while also serving practical purposes in coordinating operations. Equipment for the Tanith first reflected both their specialized role and the practical realities of Imperial logistics. They carried standard issue lasguns like other Imperial Guard regiments, as the Adeptus Munitorum insisted on maintaining equipment standardization for supply purposes. However, the Tanith modified their weapons and gear based on operational experience, adding camouflage wrappings, noise suppressors when available, and other adaptations that enhanced their stealth capabilities. Their officers fought constant bureaucratic battles with Munitorum officials who objected to these modifications as violations of equipment regulations, but Gaunt generally supported his soldiers' practical improvements over adherence to regulations that did not account for their specialized needs. The psychological profile of Tanith soldiers differed noticeably from troops in standard line infantry regiments. The trauma of their world's destruction created men who fought with particular intensity, driven by the need to prove their survival had meaning. This manifested in a refusal to accept defeat and a willingness to endure extreme hardship rather than fail in their missions. However, it also created vulnerabilities, as the regiment's collective trauma sometimes expressed itself in reckless behavior or difficulty accepting losses. Gaunt worked with the regiment's Medicae staff to address these issues, though the fundamental psychological burden of being the last survivors of Tanith remained an inescapable aspect of the regiment's identity. Relations between the Tanith First and other Imperial Guard regiments varied depending on circumstances and the personalities involved. Some conventional infantry commanders appreciated the intelligence and reconnaissance support the Tanith provided, recognizing that their specialized capabilities complemented rather than competed with line infantry roles. Others resented what they perceived as the Tanith receiving preferential treatment or avoiding the real fighting that characterized conventional engagements. These tensions occasionally erupted into conflicts between units, particularly when soldiers from different regiments found themselves competing for limited resources or recognition. Gaunt navigated these political challenges with varying degrees of success, sometimes smoothing over disputes through diplomacy, and other times responding to disrespect toward his regiment with the full authority of his commissarial rank. The covert operations that became the Tanith First's specialty required capabilities beyond pure combat skills. Intelligence gathering demanded the ability to observe and record information accurately, often while under extreme stress and in conditions where mistakes would mean capture or death. Sabotage operations required technical knowledge of enemy equipment and infrastructure, forcing the regiment to develop expertise in areas that standard infantry training did not cover. Assassination missions demanded patience and precision, as targets were often well protected and opportunities for clean strikes came rarely. The Tanith developed proficiency in all these areas through necessity and experience, transforming from newly founded regiment into one of the Crusade's most capable special operations forces. The decade following Macaroth's assumption of command saw the Sabbat Worlds Crusade transform from a war of rapid conquest into a grinding struggle for consolidation. The initial momentum that Slaydo had established through aggressive offensive operations had carried Imperial forces deep into formerly chaos-held territory, but this expansion had created vulnerabilities that became increasingly apparent as the Crusade entered its third decade. Dozens of worlds that official records listed as liberated continued to host active chaos resistance, with insurgent cells operating openly in rural areas while maintaining covert networks within supposedly pacified cities. The Imperial garrison forces assigned to these worlds found themselves engaged in continuous counterinsurgency operations that consumed resources and manpower without producing the decisive victories that characterized conventional warfare. The strategic situation across the Sabbat Worlds cluster resembled a patchwork quilt of contested space rather than clearly defined front lines. Imperial authority remained strong in systems where substantial military forces maintained permanent presence, but extended supply routes connecting these strongholds passed through regions where Chaos Raiders operated with relative impunity. Convoy losses mounted steadily as enemy forces targeted the vulnerable transport ships carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and replacement equipment between Imperial-held worlds. The Navy committed significant resources to escort duties, but the vast distances involved and the unpredictable nature of warp travel made it impossible to protect every convoy adequately. Some supply ships simply disappeared during warp transits, their fates unknown, but presumed to involve either catastrophic warp storms or interception by chaos vessels operating in the Imperium. Macaroth's emphasis on consolidation meant redirecting combat forces toward stabilization operations on worlds that previous commanders had considered secure. The 8th and 14th Army Groups received orders to conduct comprehensive pacification campaigns across the Carcharodon cluster, a collection of systems that had been liberated during the Slaydo years, but never fully brought under Imperial control. The operations that followed demonstrated the frustrating nature of counterinsurgency warfare in the 41st millennium. Imperial forces would sweep through a region, clearing out chaos cultists and destroying their bases, only to have new cells emerge months later after the Imperial troops had moved on to address problems elsewhere. The cultists operated among civilian populations that often provided them with shelter and supplies, either through genuine sympathy for chaos or simple fear of retribution. Identifying and eliminating these support networks required intelligence work and careful investigation rather than the straightforward application of military force. The Adeptus Astartes played crucial roles in these pacification efforts, bringing their expertise in law enforcement and population control to bear on problems that purely military solutions could not address. Astartes teams worked alongside Imperial Guard units to establish surveillance networks, recruit local informants, and conduct raids against suspected cult hideouts. The methods employed often proved brutal by the standards of more civilized Imperial worlds, involving mass arrests, aggressive interrogation techniques, and public executions designed to intimidate populations into compliance. These harsh measures generated resentment among civilian populations who had initially welcomed Imperial liberation, creating political complications that further hindered stabilization efforts. The ecclesiarchy maintained that spiritual reconquest represented an essential component of truly reclaiming the Sabbat Worlds from chaos dominion. Teams of priests and missionaries deployed to liberated worlds to purge heretical beliefs and restore proper worship of the Emperor. This process involved identifying and destroying chaos shrines, conducting mass purification rituals, and re-educating populations in correct imperial doctrine. The scale of this undertaking strained the ecclesiarchy's resources, as the number of worlds requiring spiritual reconquest far exceeded the available clergy. Some worlds received only cursory attention, with a handful of priests attempting to address the spiritual corruption of entire planetary populations. Others became the focus of intensive missionary efforts that transformed them into centers of renewed faith, though this concentration of resources meant neglecting other worlds that arguably needed equal attention. The Jarian operation represented one of the most ambitious and controversial undertakings of the Middle Crusade period. The world of Jarian occupied a strategic position within chaos-held territory, serving as a major logistics hub and coordination center for enemy forces operating across multiple sectors. Imperial intelligence had identified Jarian as a high-value target whose capture or disruption would significantly degrade chaos operational capabilities throughout the region. However, conventional assault on the heavily defended world appeared impractical given the forces required and the likelihood of heavy casualties. Instead, Crusade Command authorized a deep penetration mission involving the insertion of Special Operations Forces who would establish a resistance network and conduct sabotage operations behind enemy lines. Colonel Commissar Gaunt received orders to lead the Jarian mission, with elements of the Tanith first selected to form the core of the infiltration force. Additional personnel came from other regiments with relevant specializations, including communications experts, demolition specialists, and intelligence operatives. The mission parameters called for the team to insert via stealth insertion craft, make contact with any surviving Imperial resistance on Jarian, and conduct operations to disrupt enemy logistics and command structures. The timeline for the mission remained deliberately vague, with command acknowledging that extraction might not be possible for months or even years, depending on how circumstances developed on the ground. The insertion phase went catastrophically wrong from the outset. The stealth craft carrying Gaunt's team encountered unexpected warp turbulence during the approach to Jarian, throwing off navigation calculations and causing the vessel to emerge from the warp significantly off course from the planned insertion point. Chaos naval patrols detected the craft's presence almost immediately, forcing an emergency deployment that scattered the infiltration teams across a much wider area than planned. Several insertion pods were destroyed during the descent through Jarian's atmosphere, killing their occupants before they reached the surface. The survivors found themselves dispersed across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, with no immediate means of regrouping or establishing secure communications. Geryon itself had been transformed by years of chaos occupation into something that barely resembled the imperial world it had once been. The planet's atmosphere carried a sickly yellow-green tint, the result of industrial pollution from corrupted manufactories operating without any regard for environmental consequences. The cities had been rebuilt according to architectural principles that defied normal geometry, with structures that seemed to lean at impossible angles and streets that curved in ways that disoriented anyone attempting to navigate them. The civilian population showed obvious signs of chaos corruption, with mutations common enough that they no longer drew particular notice. Some citizens displayed relatively minor alterations, like discolored skin or additional digits, while others had been transformed into creatures that retained only vague resemblance to human form. The Chaos forces garrisoning Geryon maintained extensive security networks that made covert operations extremely difficult. Surveillance systems monitored major population centers continuously, with automated turrets programmed to engage any unauthorized movement in restricted zones. Patrol forces conducted regular sweeps through both urban and rural areas, searching for signs of Imperial resistance or other threats to Chaos authority. The enemy had also deployed specialized hunter-killer teams, trained specifically to track down and eliminate infiltrators, using a combination of conventional tracking methods and warp-based detection techniques that could identify individuals touched by the Emperor's light. Gaunt's team spent the first weeks on Geryon simply trying to survive and re-establish contact with other scattered elements of the infiltration force. They moved through the corrupted landscape, using every stealth technique in their repertoire, avoiding Chaos patrols and civilian populations that might report their presence to the authorities. Food and water presented constant challenges, as much of what was available on Geryon had been tainted by Chaos corruption to the point where consuming it risked mutation or worse. The team subsisted on emergency rations carried in their insertion gear, knowing that these supplies would eventually run out and force them to find alternative sources or accept the risks of consuming local resources. Contact with Imperial resistance cells on Geryon proved more difficult than mission planners had anticipated. The resistance networks that had existed immediately after the Chaos conquest had been systematically hunted down and destroyed over the intervening years, with survivors driven so deep underground that they had become nearly impossible to locate. When Gaunt's team finally made contact with a resistance cell operating in one of Geryon's secondary cities, they discovered that the group consisted of fewer than 20 individuals armed with scavenged weapons and possessing minimal intelligence about enemy operations. These resistance fighters had focused their efforts on simple survival rather than active opposition to Chaos rule, as any significant action tended to draw overwhelming retaliation that resulted in the cell's destruction. The mission objectives that had seemed achievable during planning sessions at Crusade headquarters appeared increasingly unrealistic as Gaunt's team gained first-hand understanding of conditions on Geryon. Conducting sabotage operations against hardened military targets required equipment and support that the infiltration force simply did not possess after the disastrous insertion. Establishing effective intelligence networks demanded time measured in years rather than months, as building trust with potential informants and developing secure communication methods could not be rushed without risking exposure. The team adapted their approach to focus on smaller-scale operations that lay within their capabilities, targeting isolated enemy patrols, minor supply depots, and low-level administrators whose disappearance would not immediately trigger massive security responses. The psychological toll of operating deep behind enemy lines on a world thoroughly corrupted by chaos exceeded anything that training or previous combat experience had prepared the infiltration team to handle. The constant exposure to chaos corruption, even without direct participation in heretical activities, began affecting team members in subtle ways. Some reported nightmares that felt more real than normal dreams, visions of demonic entities or twisted landscapes that left them exhausted upon waking. Others experienced periods of dissociation, where hours would pass with no clear memory of what had occurred during that time. Gaunt maintained strict watch protocols and regular prayer sessions in an attempt to counter these effects, but the fundamental reality remained that every day spent on Geryon increased the risk of corruption taking hold. Communication with Crusade Command proved sporadic at best. The team's Vox equipment could not reliably reach Imperial forces across the distances and warp interference involved, and attempts to send messages risked detection by chaos monitoring systems. Gaunt managed to establish contact with Imperial forces on a handful of occasions during the first year on Geryon, transmitting brief status reports and requesting extraction or reinforcement. The responses he received indicated that Crusade Command considered the mission ongoing and expected continued operations, but provided no concrete timeline for extraction or additional support. The infiltration team found themselves effectively abandoned on Geryon, with no clear end date for their mission, and no guarantee that extraction would ever become possible. The situation across the broader Crusade theater deteriorated significantly during this period, as Chaos forces launched major counteroffensives aimed at reclaiming worlds they had lost during the Slaydo years. The death of Archon Gower at Balhaut had initially seemed like a decisive blow to enemy command structure, but the emergence of Anaquenor Sec as a rival power center among the Chaos forces had created new complications rather than weakening enemy capabilities. Sec proved to be a capable military commander in his own right, and the forces loyal to him conducted operations with a level of coordination and strategic sophistication that matched or exceeded what Gower's armies had achieved. The Sons of Sec launched simultaneous attacks against multiple Imperial-held systems, forcing Crusade commanders to divide their forces to respond to threats across a wide front. The fall of Herodor represented one of the most significant setbacks of the Middle Crusade period. The Shrine world had been liberated early in the Slaydo years and had become a symbol of Imperial resurgence in the Sabbat Worlds, with the Ecclesiarchy investing substantial resources in restoring its temples and religious infrastructure. The garrison forces assigned to defend Herodor had grown complacent after years without facing serious threats, their training and readiness declining as commanders assumed that the world's distance from active combat zones made it secure. When Sons of Sec forces launched their assault, they achieved complete tactical surprise, with the initial attacks destroying key defensive positions before the Imperial garrison could mount effective resistance. The fighting that followed lasted for weeks, but the outcome was never seriously in doubt once the attackers had established their initial foothold. Imperial forces evacuated what personnel they could before the world fell completely under enemy control, but thousands of soldiers and millions of civilians remained trapped when the last transport ships departed. The loss of Herodor sent shockwaves through the Crusade command structure and generated intense criticism of Macaroth's leadership. Critics argued that his emphasis on consolidation had left liberated worlds vulnerable to exactly this sort of counterattack, and that Slaydo's more aggressive approach would have prevented the enemy from accumulating the strength necessary to mount such operations. The Ecclesiarchy expressed particular outrage at the loss of a Shrine world, viewing it as both a military failure and a spiritual catastrophe. Pressure mounted on the Warmaster to demonstrate that the Crusade retained the initiative and could respond effectively to the new threat represented by Sec's forces. Additional worlds fell to Chaos counteroffensives over the following years as the Sons of Sec exploited gaps in Imperial defenses and targeted systems where garrison forces were spread too thin. The pattern repeated with depressing regularity. Enemy forces would achieve surprise through rapid movement and aggressive assault tactics, overwhelm defenders who were often outnumbered and outgunned, and consolidate control before Imperial reinforcements could arrive in sufficient strength to mount effective counterattacks. Each loss forced Crusade Command to divert forces from other operations to shore up defenses elsewhere, creating a reactive posture that surrendered strategic initiative to the enemy. The logistical strain on the Crusade reached critical levels as the middle campaigns ground on year after year. The supply lines that sustained millions of Imperial soldiers stretched across vast distances through space that remained contested despite official claims of liberation. The Adeptus Munitorum struggled to maintain adequate stocks of basic supplies like ammunition and rations, let alone the specialized equipment required for specific operations. Requests from field commanders for additional resources often went unfulfilled or were delayed for months as the Munitorum bureaucracy worked to allocate scarce assets among competing priorities. Some regiments found themselves rationing ammunition and operating vehicles well past their recommended maintenance intervals because replacement parts simply were not available. The Navy faced its own resource challenges as years of sustained combat operations took their toll on ships and crews. Vessels that had been in continuous service since the Crusade's beginning required extensive refits to address accumulated damage and worn-out systems, but the available shipyard capacity could not accommodate all the ships that needed attention. Crews suffered from exhaustion and declining morale as deployment cycles stretched on without adequate rest periods between combat operations. The loss of experienced personnel to casualties or transfers created training challenges, as replacements lacked the institutional knowledge and combat experience of the veterans they replaced. Fleet commanders found themselves making difficult decisions about which vessels to prioritize for maintenance, and which would have to continue operating despite mounting mechanical problems and crew fatigue. Political pressure from Terra intensified as reports of the Crusade's difficulties reached the High Lords and other Imperial authorities. The enormous investment of resources in the Sabbat Worlds campaign had been justified by promises of decisive victory and the complete liberation of the region from chaos control. More than 2 decades into the Crusade, those promises remained unfulfilled, with significant portions of the Sabbat Worlds still under enemy dominion and even supposedly liberated systems, requiring ongoing military presence to maintain Imperial authority. Questions arose about whether the Crusade represented an effective use of Imperial military assets, or whether those forces might be better deployed addressing threats elsewhere in the galaxy. Macaroth faced demands to show measurable progress and demonstrate that the Crusade could achieve its stated objectives within a reasonable timeframe. The Warmaster responded to these pressures by authorizing renewed offensive operations aimed at capturing high-value targets that would demonstrate the Crusade's continued viability. These operations required concentrating forces that had been dispersed across numerous garrison and pacification duties, accepting increased risk to currently held territories in exchange for the opportunity to achieve significant victories. The planning for these offensives consumed months as staff officers analyzed intelligence reports, assessed logistical requirements, and coordinated the movement of units from across the Crusade theater. Macaroth understood that failure in these operations would likely cost him his command and potentially lead to the Crusade being scaled back or even terminated, making success not just militarily important, but personally crucial to his continued authority. The grinding nature of the middle campaigns affected morale throughout the Imperial forces in ways that earlier periods of rapid advance had not. Soldiers who had enlisted expecting glorious victories and quick returns to their homeworlds found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of combat operations, garrison duties, and pacification missions with no clear end in sight. The casualty rates, while not catastrophic by Imperial Guard standards, steadily eroded the veteran core of many regiments as experienced soldiers were killed or wounded and replaced by fresh recruits who lacked the hard-won knowledge that came from surviving multiple campaigns. Unit cohesion suffered as regiments lost the officers and non-commissioned officers who had held them together through earlier battles, with replacements often struggling to earn the trust and respect of soldiers who had fought together for years. The commissariat worked to maintain discipline and fighting spirit through the traditional methods of inspiration and intimidation, but even commissars found their task more difficult as the war dragged on without decisive resolution. Summary executions for cowardice or desertion became more common as some soldiers cracked under the cumulative stress of sustained combat operations. Other soldiers turned to religion, seeking comfort in the imperial creed and the promise of the emperor's protection. Ecclesiarchy chaplains attached to Imperial Guard regiments found themselves conducting more prayer services and spiritual counseling sessions as soldiers grappled with questions about the purpose of their sacrifices and whether their suffering served any meaningful goal. The industrial capacity of the Sabbat Worlds represented a strategic prize that both Imperial and Chaos forces recognized as essential to sustaining prolonged military operations. The Forge worlds scattered throughout the cluster possessed manufactoria capable of producing everything from basic ammunition and replacement parts to sophisticated vehicles and weapon systems. Control over these production facilities translated directly into military advantage, as forces with reliable access to locally produced supplies could operate with greater flexibility and endurance than those dependent on supply lines stretching across multiple sectors. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintained nominal authority over Forge world operations within Imperial territory, but the realities of Crusade warfare meant that military necessity often overrode normal Mechanicus protocols and traditions. Urdesh occupied the position of greatest importance among the Forge worlds involved in the Crusade. The planet's liberation during the Slaydo years had provided Imperial forces with access to extensive manufacturing infrastructure, though the initial reclamation had left much of that infrastructure damaged or corrupted beyond immediate use. The years following liberation saw continuous efforts to restore Urdesh's productive capacity, with tech priests from multiple Forge worlds dispatched to assist in purification rituals and reconstruction work. The scale of corruption that Chaos forces had inflicted on the planet's industrial facilities exceeded what many Mechanicus adepts had anticipated. Entire production lines had been deliberately tainted through demonic rituals that infused machinery with warp energy, creating equipment that could not simply be cleansed through standard purification procedures, but instead required complete dismantling and reconstruction from salvaged components. The tech priests assigned to Urdesh's restoration worked in conditions that tested even their legendary patience and dedication to the machine god. Many manufactoria had been booby-trapped by retreating Chaos forces, with explosive charges or more esoteric threats hidden within machinery in ways designed to kill anyone attempting repairs. Other facilities showed signs of deliberate sabotage that went beyond simple destruction, with critical components removed or damaged in patterns suggesting intimate knowledge of how the equipment functioned. The Mechanicus teams proceeded methodically through each facility, conducting exhaustive inspections and performing the necessary rites to determine which equipment could be salvaged and which required complete replacement. This process consumed years of effort and diverted substantial Mechanicus resources that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. Despite these challenges, Urdesh gradually returned to productive operation. The first manufactoria to come back online focused on producing basic supplies that the Crusade consumed in vast quantities: standard pattern lasguns, flak armor, ammunition for various weapon types, and replacement parts for commonly used vehicles. The output from these restored facilities, while modest compared to what Urdesh had produced before the Chaos invasion, still represented a significant improvement over the previous situation, where all such supplies had to be transported from Forge worlds outside the Sabbat Worlds cluster. Crusade logisticians calculated that local production from Urdesh reduced supply convoy requirements by approximately 15%, freeing up transport capacity for materials that could not be manufactured locally. The restoration of more sophisticated production capabilities proceeded more slowly. Manufactoria designed to produce vehicles like Chimera transports or Leman Russ battle tanks required specialized equipment and technical knowledge that proved difficult to replace after years of Chaos occupation. The Mechanicus tech priests responsible for these facilities insisted on conducting elaborate purification ceremonies before allowing any machinery to resume operation. arguing that the corruption inflicted by Chaos forces had penetrated too deeply to risk shortcuts. Military commanders, frustrated by the slow pace of restoration, sometimes clashed with Mechanicus representatives over priorities, with the former demanding faster results, while the latter refused to compromise on procedures they considered essential for preventing further contamination. The security situation on Urdesh remained precarious throughout the Middle Crusade period, despite the world's official liberation. Chaos cultists who had gone underground during the Imperial assault continued operating in the planet's industrial zones, conducting sabotage operations designed to disrupt production and undermine restoration efforts. These saboteurs possessed detailed knowledge of Urdesh's infrastructure from their time serving Chaos occupation forces, allowing them to identify vulnerable points and plan attacks that caused maximum damage with minimal resources. Imperial security forces and Adeptus Astartes teams conducted continuous counter-sabotage operations, attempting to identify and eliminate cult cells before they could strike, but the sheer size of Urdesh's industrial complexes made comprehensive security coverage impossible. A particularly devastating sabotage attack in 776 destroyed a recently restored munitions facility on Urdesh's northern continent. The explosion that consumed the facility registered on seismographs across half the planet, and the resulting fire burned for 3 days before emergency response teams brought it under control. Investigation revealed that cultists had infiltrated the facility's workforce months earlier, patiently waiting for production to reach full capacity before triggering explosive charges they had hidden within the structure. The attack killed over 2,000 workers and tech priests, destroyed equipment that had taken years to restore, and set back munitions production targets by at least a year. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate casualties, as workers at other facilities grew increasingly paranoid about potential saboteurs among their colleagues, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that hindered normal operations. The Adeptus Mechanicus response to the Urdesh sabotage involved implementing more stringent security protocols that many workers found intrusive and degrading. Mandatory genetic screening attempted to identify individuals showing signs of Chaos corruption, though the reliability of such tests remained questionable and false positives created their own problems. Regular interrogations by Mechanicus security personnel and Astartes investigators consumed work time and generated resentment among laborers who felt they were being treated as suspects rather than loyal Imperial citizens. The balance between maintaining adequate security and preserving productive efficiency proved difficult to achieve, with different Mechanicus factions advocating for various approaches based on their own philosophical interpretations of proper procedure. Beyond Urdesh, other Forge worlds within the Sabbat Worlds cluster contributed to the Crusade's industrial capacity with varying degrees of effectiveness. Fortis Binary had been liberated during the early campaigns and had suffered less severe corruption than Urdesh, allowing its manufactoria to return to operation more quickly. The world specialized in producing power cells and energy weapons, output that proved particularly valuable given the Imperial Guard's heavy reliance on lasguns and other energy-based armaments. Fortis Binary's tech priests maintained relatively cordial relations with Crusade military authorities, cooperating with supply requests and accepting military oversight of their operations with less resistance than their counterparts on other Forge worlds. Naistan represented a different situation entirely. The Forge world remained under Chaos control throughout the Middle Crusade period, its manufactoria producing weapons and equipment for enemy forces operating across multiple sectors. Imperial intelligence reports indicated that Naistan's output rivaled or exceeded what Urdesh provided to Imperial forces, giving Chaos armies access to locally produced supplies that reduced their own logistical vulnerabilities. Multiple proposals for operations to capture or neutralize Naistan circulated through Crusade command channels, but the world's formidable defenses and strategic location deep within enemy-held territory made such operations extremely difficult to execute. The Sons of Sek had reinforced Naiston's garrison significantly after observing Imperial efforts to restore Urdesh, clearly recognizing the strategic value of maintaining their own industrial base. The Titan legions deployed to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade represented the most spectacular manifestation of Adeptus Mechanicus military power. These colossal war machines stood dozens of meters tall, their weapons capable of leveling city blocks or destroying armored formations with single volleys. The Legio Fortidus, known as the Fists of Fortitude, maintained the largest Titan presence in the Crusade theater, with multiple maniples of Warlord class and Reaver class Titans operating from bases on liberated Forge worlds. The deployment and maintenance of Titans required enormous logistical support, as each war machine consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that strained even well-established supply networks. The tech priests responsible for Titan operations maintained their own hierarchies and command structures that operated largely independently of conventional military authorities, coordinating with Crusade command when objectives aligned, but pursuing their own priorities when they deemed it appropriate. Titan deployments typically occurred during major offensive operations, where their overwhelming firepower could prove decisive. The assault on Morlon during the Slaydo years had featured substantial Titan support, with Warlord-class machines advancing alongside conventional armor to breach enemy fortifications that had resisted previous attacks. The psychological impact of Titans on the battlefield extended beyond their actual combat capabilities, as their sheer size and the thunderous reports of their weapons created terror among enemy forces and inspired Imperial troops fighting alongside them. However, the limited number of Titans available and the extensive support they required meant that most Imperial Guard regiments fought their entire tour in the Sabbat Worlds without ever seeing one of the massive war machines in action. The Tech Priest expedition forces that accompanied Titan deployments and operated independently throughout the Crusade pursued objectives that sometimes seemed tangential to the main military campaign. These expeditions searched for archaeotech artifacts, investigated rumors of lost standard template construct systems, and conducted surveys of industrial facilities on both liberated and enemy-held worlds. The Mechanicus maintained that these activities supported the broader war effort by potentially recovering technology that could enhance Imperial capabilities, but military commanders sometimes questioned whether the resources devoted to such expeditions might be better spent on more immediate military needs. The tension between Mechanicus priorities and military necessity created ongoing friction within the Crusade command structure, with neither side willing to fully subordinate their objectives to the other's vision. Sabotage operations conducted by Imperial forces against chaos-held industrial facilities represented a major component of the Crusade's strategy for degrading enemy capabilities. Special operations teams infiltrated enemy territory to attack manufactoria, power generation facilities, and supply depots, aiming to disrupt production and force chaos forces to divert resources towards security and reconstruction. The Tanith First and other reconnaissance specialized regiments conducted numerous such operations throughout the Middle Crusade period, with varying degrees of success. Some raids achieved spectacular results, destroying facilities that took months or years for the enemy to restore. Others ended in failure when security proved tighter than intelligence reports had suggested, resulting in the loss of entire teams without accomplishing their objectives. The most successful sabotage operations combined careful planning with intimate knowledge of target facilities. Imperial intelligence services worked to recruit informants among populations living under chaos occupation, seeking individuals who could provide detailed information about security arrangements, production schedules, and facility layouts. These informants risked horrific deaths if their activities were discovered, making recruitment difficult and information reliability questionable. Some supposed informants proved to be enemy agents feeding false intelligence designed to lure Imperial forces into traps, while others provided accurate information but were discovered and eliminated before their intelligence could be acted upon. The intelligence services accepted these risks as inherent to their operations, calculating that even a modest success rate justified the resources invested in developing informant networks. Chaos sabotage operations against Imperial industrial facilities demonstrated similar sophistication and caused comparable disruption. Enemy agents infiltrated liberated worlds through various means, sometimes posing as refugees or workers seeking employment in restored manufactoria. Once in position, these agents conducted reconnaissance, recruited local sympathizers, and eventually executed attacks designed to cause maximum damage to Imperial production capacity. The attack on Urdesh represented only the most dramatic example of a pattern that repeated across multiple Forge worlds throughout the Crusade theater. Imperial security forces struggled to counter these infiltration efforts effectively, as the sheer number of workers required to operate industrial facilities made comprehensive background checks impractical, and the desperation of populations living in war zones created vulnerabilities that enemy recruiters could exploit. The competition for skilled technical personnel created additional complications in managing industrial operations across the Crusade theater. Both military forces and industrial facilities required individuals with specialized knowledge of machinery, electronics, and other technical disciplines. The Adeptus Mechanicus jealously guarded its monopoly on advanced technical knowledge, insisting that only properly trained tech priests should perform maintenance on sophisticated equipment. However, the realities of sustained military operations meant that regiments often had to rely on soldiers with informal technical training to keep their vehicles and equipment operational, as waiting for Mechanicus personnel to become available could mean accepting unacceptable delays. This tension between Mechanicus doctrine and military necessity played out repeatedly across the Crusade, with field commanders making pragmatic decisions that violated Mechanicus protocols, and then facing criticism from tech priests who viewed such improvisation as dangerous heresy. The Forge world of Urdesh became not just an industrial center, but also a symbol of the Crusade's ability to reclaim and restore what chaos had corrupted. Macaroth understood the propaganda value of pointing to Urdesh's restored manufactoria as evidence that the Crusade was making meaningful progress toward its objectives. Official reports emphasized production figures and restoration milestones, presenting Urdesh as a success story that justified the enormous investment of resources the Crusade required. The reality proved more complicated, as the ongoing security problems and slower than hoped restoration of advanced manufacturing capabilities suggested that truly reclaiming a Forge world from chaos occupation required decades of sustained effort rather than the quick victories that made for compelling propaganda. Nevertheless, the partial restoration of Urdesh's industrial capacity did represent genuine progress, providing tangible benefits to Imperial forces operating throughout the Sabbat Worlds, and demonstrating that liberated worlds could contribute meaningfully to the war effort rather than remaining permanent drains on Crusade resources. The Void War that accompanied the Sabbat Worlds Crusade represented a dimension of the conflict that often received less attention than the ground campaigns, yet proved equally crucial to determining the campaign's outcome. Control of orbital space around contested worlds determined which side could safely land reinforcements, resupply ground forces, and conduct bombardments in support of surface operations. The Imperial Navy committed substantial assets to the Crusade from its inception, assembling a fleet that came to be designated Battle Fleet Sabbat, and that eventually numbered thousands of vessels ranging from massive battleships to humble system monitors. The composition and command of this fleet evolved throughout the decades-long campaign as losses mounted, new vessels arrived from distant shipyards, and strategic priorities shifted in response to changing circumstances. Lord High Admiral Ornoff commanded Battle Fleet Sabbat during the initial phases of the Crusade, bringing decades of experience in void warfare to the task of coordinating naval operations across the sprawling theater. Ornoff had distinguished himself during campaigns in the Gothic sector, and understood the complexities of managing fleet operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. His command style emphasized aggressive action and the concentration of force at decisive points, philosophies that aligned well with Warmaster Slaydo's strategic approach during those early years. Ornoff established his headquarters aboard the battleship Dominus Astra, a vessel whose weapons, batteries, and armor plating had been tested in dozens of engagements before arriving in the Sabbat Worlds. The initial naval operations focused on clearing Chaos forces from the void around target worlds and establishing orbital supremacy that would allow ground forces to land without facing devastating fire from enemy ships. These engagements followed patterns familiar to Imperial Navy officers, with opposing fleets maneuvering for advantage before closing to weapons range and exchanging broadsides from their macro batteries and lance weapons. The Chaos naval forces that opposed these early Imperial advances consisted primarily of vessels that had been captured during the initial invasion or constructed in shipyards within occupied territory. Some enemy ships were recognizably Imperial designs that had been modified with Chaos iconography and warp-tainted technology, while others displayed more radical alterations that made their origins difficult to determine. The Void Battle for Balhaut in 765 represented the largest naval engagement of the early Crusade period. Lord High Admiral Ornoff committed the bulk of Battle Fleet Sabbat to the operation, assembling a fleet that included 6 battleships, 23 cruisers of various classes, and over 100 escorts and support vessels. The Chaos forces defending Balhaut had concentrated their own naval assets in anticipation of the Imperial assault, creating a defensive formation that incorporated both mobile fleet elements and fixed orbital fortifications. The battle that resulted consumed weeks of sustained combat as the two fleets engaged in a grinding exchange of fire that saw dozens of ships destroyed or crippled on both sides. The opening phase of the Balhaut Void Battle saw Imperial forces attempting to break through the outer defensive perimeter established by Chaos vessels and orbital weapon platforms. Ornoff divided his fleet into 3 attack groups, each assigned to assault a different section of the enemy defensive line, with the goal of creating breaches that could be exploited by follow-up forces. The lead elements consisted primarily of cruisers and heavy escorts, vessels with sufficient armor and firepower to withstand the concentrated fire they would face while closing with enemy positions. These ships advanced in tight formations, their void shields flaring as they absorbed hits from enemy weapons, while their own guns returned fire at maximum rate. The Chaos defenders employed tactics that demonstrated considerable sophistication, falling back from initial positions in good order while maintaining concentrated fire on advancing Imperial vessels. They had positioned their orbital fortifications to create overlapping fields of fire that forced Imperial ships to run gauntlets of weapons fire as they advanced. Several Imperial cruisers took catastrophic damage during these approach runs, their hulls breached by lance strikes or torn open by macro battery salvos that overwhelmed their void shields. The cruiser Indomitable will suffered a reactor breach that killed most of its crew and left the vessel drifting as a lifeless hulk. The Righteous Fury lost its entire forward weapons battery to a direct hit that penetrated its armored prow and detonated in the magazine spaces below. Despite these losses, the Imperial attack groups succeeded in breaching the outer defensive perimeter and engaging the mobile Chaos fleet elements directly. The battle devolved into a chaotic melee as ships from both sides maneuvered for advantage while maintaining fire on any enemy vessel that came within range. The close quarters nature of the engagement negated some of the advantages that proper fleet coordination might have provided, instead favoring individual ship commanders who could make quick tactical decisions and exploit fleeting opportunities. Captain Helios of the Imperial cruiser Sword of Vengeance distinguished himself during this phase, maneuvering his vessel to deliver devastating broadsides against 2 Chaos cruisers in rapid succession before withdrawing to recharge his weapons batteries. The destruction of the orbital fortifications required sustained bombardment from Imperial battleships that had advanced into firing positions once the mobile Chaos fleet had been pushed back. These massive vessels brought their full weapons complements to bear on the fortifications, their lance batteries and Nova cannons delivering firepower that could crack open even heavily armored structures. The fortifications responded with their own weapons, and the exchange of fire at close range resulted in damage to several Imperial battleships that would require months of repair work to address fully. The battleship Emperor's Wrath took multiple hits to its port side that destroyed several weapons batteries and killed hundreds of crew members, though the vessel remained operational and continued engaging enemy positions. The final phase of the Balhaut Void battle saw the remnants of the Chaos fleet attempting to break through the Imperial cordon and escape into deep space. Lord High Admiral Ornoff had anticipated this possibility and had positioned fast attack groups consisting of light cruisers and destroyers to intercept any vessels attempting to flee. These pursuit forces hunted down the escaping Chaos ships, engaging in running battles that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. Some enemy vessels managed to reach minimum safe distance and translate into the warp, escaping destruction, but removing themselves from the battle. Others were caught and destroyed before they could complete their warp jumps, their reactors detonating as Imperial weapons fire overwhelmed their remaining defenses. The victory at Balhaut secured orbital control and allowed Imperial ground forces to land and prosecute their campaign to liberate the world, but the cost in ships and personnel had been substantial. Battlefleet Sabbat had lost 9 cruisers destroyed outright, and another 15 damaged severely enough to require extended repairs. Thousands of Navy personnel had died in the fighting, including several ship captains and other senior officers whose experience would be difficult to replace. The damaged vessels required months in orbital shipyards before they could return to active service, reducing the fleet's available strength during a period when new operations were being planned across multiple systems. The command structure of Battlefleet Sabbat evolved as the Crusade progressed, and as losses created vacancies in senior positions. Lord High Admiral Ornoff died when his flagship suffered a catastrophic reactor failure during an engagement in the Cabal system. The circumstances of the failure remained unclear, with some reports suggesting sabotage by Chaos agents who had infiltrated the vessel's crew, while others attributed it to simple mechanical failure resulting from years of sustained operations without adequate maintenance. Regardless of the cause, Ornoff's death created an immediate succession crisis within the fleet's command structure. Lord High Admiral Sart assumed command of Battlefleet Sabbat following Ornoff's death, bringing a different command philosophy to fleet operations. Where Ornoff had favored aggressive tactics and the concentration of force, Sartoy emphasized the importance of maintaining fleet cohesion and preserving vessels for long-term operations. This more cautious approach aligned with Warmaster Macaroth's strategic emphasis on consolidation rather than rapid expansion, but it generated criticism from officers who believed that the Navy should be conducting more aggressive operations against enemy-held systems. Sart established his headquarters aboard the battleship Dominus Regalis and reorganized the fleet's command structure to create more clearly defined squadron assignments and operational sectors. The ongoing blockade operations that Battlefleet Sabbat maintained around contested systems represented a crucial but unglamorous aspect of the naval campaign. These blockades aimed to prevent enemy forces from receiving reinforcements or supplies via space, while also interdicting any attempt by Chaos forces to evacuate valuable personnel or equipment from worlds under Imperial assault. Maintaining effective blockades required positioning vessels at key points around target systems, typically focusing on major translation points where ships entering or leaving the warp would most likely emerge. The Navy assigned squadrons consisting of cruisers and escorts to blockade duties, rotating units through these assignments to prevent crew fatigue and maintain operational readiness. The blockade of the Morlan system during the siege of that world demonstrated both the importance and the challenges of such operations. Imperial Navy squadrons established positions around the system's primary translation points, creating a cordon designed to intercept any Chaos vessels attempting to reach or leave Morland. The blockade succeeded in preventing large-scale reinforcement of the planet's garrison, forcing the defenders to rely on whatever supplies and personnel they already possessed. However, smaller vessels and those willing to risk dangerous warp translations at non-standard points sometimes managed to slip through the blockade, delivering limited supplies or evacuating key Chaos personnel before Imperial forces could intercept them. The strategic importance of controlling system translation points became increasingly apparent as the Crusade progressed. These locations, where the geometry of real space and the currents of the warp made transitions between dimensions relatively safe and predictable, served as natural choke points for interstellar travel. Forces that controlled translation points could regulate traffic into and out of systems, giving them enormous leverage over military and commercial operations. The Navy devoted substantial resources to establishing permanent monitoring stations and defensive platforms at major translation points in liberated systems, creating infrastructure that would allow rapid response to any enemy incursion attempts. The naval bastion established at Balhaut after the world's liberation served as the primary forward operating base for Battle Fleet Sabbat throughout the Middle and later Crusade periods. The bastion consisted of orbital shipyards, ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, and defensive platforms that together created a fortified position capable of supporting large-scale fleet operations. Ships could dock at the bastion for repairs and resupply without needing to return to more distant Imperial naval bases, significantly reducing the time vessels spent in transit rather than on operational deployment. The construction of the Balhaut bastion required years of effort and enormous resources, with specialized construction ships and thousands of workers laboring to build the necessary facilities in orbit around the reclaimed world. The defensive capabilities of the Balhaut bastion reflected lessons learned from earlier engagements. The orbital platforms mounted weapons batteries comparable to those found on cruiser-class vessels, giving them the firepower to engage enemy ships that might attempt to attack the bastion. Void shield generators protected critical facilities from long-range bombardment, while point defense systems provided protection against torpedoes and attack craft. The bastion's garrison included several squadrons of Imperial Navy vessels permanently assigned to its defense, ensuring that any enemy force attempting to assault the facility would face immediate resistance, while reinforcements were summoned from other sectors. Chaos naval forces operating in the Sabbat Worlds included a mix of vessels with varied origins and capabilities. Some were Imperial Navy ships that had been captured during the initial invasion or that had defected to Chaos through the corruption of their crews. These vessels retained their basic Imperial design characteristics, but had been modified with Chaos iconography and sometimes more substantial alterations involving warp-tainted technology. The modifications often enhanced certain capabilities while introducing unpredictable elements, as warp-touch systems did not always function according to normal physical principles. A Chaos cruiser might demonstrate acceleration or maneuverability that exceeded what its reactor output should theoretically support, or its weapons might inflict damage that seemed disproportionate to their apparent size and power. Other Chaos vessels displayed more radical departures from Imperial designs, suggesting construction in shipyards that had operated under Chaos control for extended periods. These ships incorporated architectural elements that defied conventional engineering principles, with hulls that curved in impossible ways or weapons that appeared to draw power from sources other than standard plasma reactors. Tech priests who examined wreckage from such vessels reported finding components that should not have functioned according to their understanding of mechanics and energy systems, yet clearly had operated effectively before the ship's destruction. The Adeptus Mechanicus declared such technology anathema and ordered that all recovered examples be destroyed rather than studied, fearing that even examination of Chaos-tainted machinery risked corruption. The constant threat of warp spawned incursions added an element of unpredictability to naval operations throughout the Crusade. demonic entities sometimes manifested aboard ships during warp transit, attacking crews and attempting to corrupt or destroy vessels from within. These manifestations occurred more frequently in regions where the barrier between real space and the warp had been weakened by prolonged chaos presence, making travel through certain warp routes particularly dangerous. Navy vessels maintained detachments of armed crew members trained to respond to demonic incursions, and larger ships often carried sanctioned psychers whose abilities could help detect and combat warp entities before they caused catastrophic damage. The loss of the cruiser Eternal Vigilance to demonic incursion in the year 774 of the 41st Millennium demonstrated the severity of this threat. The vessel had been transiting through the warp en route to reinforce Imperial forces in the Khan system when crew members reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena throughout the ship. Before the captain could order an emergency translation back to real space, demons manifested in multiple sections of the vessel simultaneously, slaughtering crew members and corrupting ship systems. The few survivors who managed to reach escape pods before the ship's destruction reported that the demons had seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, appearing without warning and attacking with supernatural ferocity. The Eternal Vigilance was declared lost with all hands, and subsequent investigation revealed that several other ships had disappeared under similar circumstances during warp transits through the same region. Convoy operations represented a critical but dangerous necessity for sustaining the Crusade's ground forces. Supply ships carrying ammunition, fuel, food, and other essential materials traveled regularly between Imperial-held systems, their routes carefully planned to minimize exposure to enemy raiders while maintaining delivery schedules. These convoys typically consisted of multiple transport vessels, escorted by Navy warships assigned to protect them from attack. The escorts ranged from single destroyers accompanying small convoys to squadrons of cruisers guarding particularly valuable or vulnerable shipments. Despite these precautions, convoy losses occurred with depressing regularity as Chaos Raiders identified vulnerable targets and struck with hit-and-run tactics designed to overwhelm escorts before they could mount effective defense. The attack on Convoy Primus 77 illustrated the challenges of protecting supply lines across the vast distances of the Sabbat Worlds. The convoy consisted of 12 transport ships carrying ammunition and replacement vehicles for Imperial Guard forces operating in the Karkaradan cluster. 2 destroyers provided escort, their captains confident that the route through relatively secure space posed minimal risk. Chaos Raiders struck while the convoy was in transit between systems, emerging from the warp at close range and immediately opening fire on the transports. The escort destroyers engaged the raiders, but found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. 3 transports were destroyed outright in the initial attack, their cargoes detonating spectacularly as ammunition stores were breached. 4 more suffered damage severe enough to require emergency repairs before they could continue their journey. The raiders withdrew before Imperial reinforcements could arrive, having accomplished their objective of disrupting supply deliveries and forcing the Navy to divert additional resources to convoy protection. The establishment of patrol routes and rapid response forces represented the Navy's attempt to counter the raider threat. Squadrons of fast cruisers and destroyers maintained regular patrols along major supply routes, positioned to respond quickly if convoys reported contact with enemy forces. These patrol forces achieved some success in deterring attacks and occasionally caught raiders before they could escape after striking convoys. However, the vast distances involved and the limited number of vessels available meant that patrol coverage remained incomplete, leaving gaps that determined enemy commanders could exploit. The Navy calculated acceptable loss rates for convoy operations, acknowledging that some percentage of shipments would inevitably be lost, while working to keep those losses below levels that would seriously impact ground operations. Attack craft operations from both Imperial and Chaos carriers added another dimension to the Void War. Fury interceptors and Starhawk bombers launched from Imperial carriers conducted strikes against enemy vessels and installations, their speed and maneuverability allowing them to exploit opportunities that larger ships could not. Chaos forces employed their own attack craft, often crewed by pilots whose corruption granted them enhanced reflexes or resistance to the physical stresses of high-speed maneuvering. The dogfights between opposing attack craft squadrons created spectacular displays as dozens of small craft twisted and turned through space, their weapons' fire creating brief flashes of light against the void's darkness. Pilots from both sides developed reputations based on their kill counts and survival through multiple engagements, though the attrition rate among attack craft crews remained high regardless of skill level. The Space Marines who participated in the Sabbat Worlds Crusade operated according to doctrines and command structures fundamentally different from the Imperial Guard regiments that comprised the bulk of Imperial forces, where Guard commanders answered to the Crusade's hierarchical command structure and followed orders issued from Warmaster Macaroth's headquarters. The Adeptus Astartes maintained their traditional autonomy. Chapter masters and force commanders coordinated with Crusade leadership when objectives aligned, but retained absolute authority over their own forces and pursued missions according to their own strategic assessments. This independence sometimes created friction with Imperial Guard officers who found themselves unable to requisition Space Marine support for operations they considered critical. But it also allowed the Astartes to apply their unique capabilities where they would prove most effective rather than being dispersed piecemeal across the theater. The White Scars maintained the most substantial and consistent presence among the chapters participating in the Crusade. The chapter's affinity for rapid strike warfare and mobile operations aligned well with the fluid nature of combat across the Sabbat Worlds, where front lines remained poorly defined and opportunities for decisive action often appeared and disappeared quickly. The White Scars deployed multiple strike forces to the theater at various points throughout the campaign, with company strength elements rotating through deployments that typically lasted between 6 months and 2 years before returning to their fortress monastery for rest and rearmament. These deployments allowed the chapter to contribute meaningfully to the Crusade while maintaining its commitments to other regions where its forces operated. The White Scars' tactical doctrine emphasized speed and shock action. Their forces typically included substantial numbers of bikes and land speeders, vehicles that provided the mobility necessary for the rapid strikes that characterized their operations. A typical White Scars assault would begin with reconnaissance elements identifying enemy positions and vulnerabilities, followed by the concentration of force at a decisive point where a swift attack could achieve disproportionate results. The Space Marines would strike hard and fast, overwhelming defenders before they could organize effective resistance, then withdraw before enemy reinforcements could arrive to contain the breakthrough. This approach proved particularly effective against Chaos forces, whose command structures often struggled to coordinate responses to sudden threats appearing in unexpected locations. The liberation of Khan Group during the Middle Crusade period demonstrated White Scars' capabilities at their finest. The Star Cluster had fallen under Chaos control early in the invasion and had resisted multiple Imperial attempts at reconquest. The enemy had established fortified positions on the cluster's primary worlds and maintained mobile reserves that could respond quickly to Imperial attacks, creating a defensive network that conventional assaults had failed to crack. The White Scars analyzed the situation and identified that the Chaos command and control infrastructure relied heavily on a communications relay facility on the moon of Khan Secundus. Rather than attempting to fight through the heavily defended approaches to major enemy positions, the White Scars launched a rapid strike directly at the relay facility. The attack force consisted of 3 companies of White Scars supported by elements of the Imperial Navy who provided orbital insertion and fire support. The Space Marines deployed via drop pod assault, their pods screaming through Khan Secundus's thin atmosphere to deliver their passengers directly onto the moon's surface within striking distance of the target facility. The Chaos garrison, accustomed to defending against conventional ground approaches, found themselves facing Space Marines who had bypassed their outer defenses entirely. The White Scars fought through the facility's defenders with the brutal efficiency that centuries of combat experience provided, their bolters and chainswords making short work of cultist soldiers who lacked the training or equipment to stand against Adeptus Astartes assault troops. The destruction of the communications relay created immediate cascading effects across the Chaos defensive network throughout Khan Group. Enemy commanders lost their ability to coordinate responses to threats or request reinforcements from neighboring systems. Imperial Guard forces conducting simultaneous attacks on other worlds in the cluster found resistance collapsing as defenders failed to receive orders or support. Within weeks of the White Scars operation, Imperial forces had secured control of the entire Khan Group at a fraction of the casualties that previous attempts had cost. The success validated the Space Marine approach of identifying and striking at critical enemy vulnerabilities, rather than engaging in attritional warfare against fortified positions. The Iron Snakes operated in the Sabbat Worlds with less frequency than the White Scars, but left equally significant marks when they deployed. The chapter's organization into autonomous squads that operated independently suited the dispersed nature of many Crusade operations. Individual Iron Snake squads would accept specific missions from Crusade Command, conduct their operations with minimal support from other Imperial forces, and return to report success or failure. This approach meant that Iron Snake's presence rarely achieved the concentration of force that full company deployments from other chapters provided, but it allowed the chapter to influence events across a wider geographic area than would otherwise have been possible. An Iron Snake squad led by Sergeant Priad conducted one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the entire Crusade on the world of Idon. The planet had been officially liberated years earlier, but intelligence reports indicated that a high-ranking Chaos sorcerer had established a hidden sanctuary in Idon's equatorial jungle regions. The sorcerer, identified as Vithir Tark, had been conducting rituals designed to summon demonic entities, and was believed to be planning a major attack that could destabilize Imperial control across multiple nearby systems. Crusade Command requested Iron Snake's intervention, and Sergeant Priad's squad accepted the mission. The 10-man squad inserted via stealth insertion craft, landing in the jungle several hundred kilometers from the suspected location of Tark's sanctuary. They moved through the dense vegetation using tracking skills and enhanced senses to follow traces of warp corruption that normal humans would never have detected. The jungle itself had been tainted by the sorcerer's presence, with plants growing in twisted configurations and wildlife displaying mutations that marked them as touched by chaos. The Iron Snakes pressed forward despite these hazards, their power armor protecting them from environmental threats, while their training allowed them to navigate terrain that would have stopped conventional forces. The sanctuary proved to be a temple complex constructed from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Cultist guards patrolled the perimeter, but their vigilance proved insufficient against Space Marines who had spent decades perfecting infiltration techniques. The Iron Snakes eliminated the sentries silently, their combat knives finding vital points before victims could raise alarms. Once inside the temple, the squad fought through chambers filled with cultists and summoned demons, their bolters roaring in the confined spaces as they advanced toward the central sanctum where Tark conducted his rituals. The confrontation with the sorcerer tested the Iron Snakes in ways that conventional combat did not. Tark wielded powers that could kill with thought and summoned warp entities that materialized from thin air to attack the Space Marines. Sergeant Priad lost 3 members of his squad in the fighting, their gene-enhanced bodies proving vulnerable to psychic attacks that bypassed physical armor. The survivors pressed forward through sheer determination, their faith in the Emperor providing spiritual armor against the corruption that saturated the temple. Priad himself struck the killing blow, his power sword severing Tark's head even as the sorcerer attempted to unleash a final psychic assault. The temple complex collapsed as the rituals binding it together failed, forcing the surviving Iron Snakes to fight their way clear of falling masonry and dissipating warp energies. The Silver Guard maintained a company strength presence at various points throughout the Crusade, their forces participating in major operations alongside Imperial Guard armies. The chapter's tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination and the integration of Space Marine capabilities with conventional forces. Silver Guard commanders worked closely with Imperial Guard officers to plan operations that leveraged the strengths of both force types, using Space Marine shock troops to break through enemy defenses, while Guard regiments exploited the breakthroughs and consolidated captured territory. This approach required more coordination than the independent operations favored by chapters like the White Scars or Iron Snakes, but it produced results that demonstrated the potential of effective cooperation between Astartes and baseline human forces. The assault on the fortress world of Morland during the Slaydo years had included significant Silver Guard participation. A full company of Silver Guard Space Marines had deployed to support the siege, their Terminator armored veterans proving crucial in breaching the heavily fortified bunker complexes that protected key enemy positions. The Terminators advanced through fire that would have annihilated conventional assault troops, their tactical dreadnought armor-absorbing hits from heavy weapons, while their storm bolters and power fists dealt death to any defenders who stood their ground. The presence of Space Marines in the assault provided a psychological boost to Imperial Guard regiments fighting alongside them, as soldiers drew courage from seeing the Emperor's finest warriors leading the attack. The relationship between Space Marine forces and overall Crusade strategic planning remained complex throughout the campaign. Warmaster Macaroth understood that he could not simply order Space Marine chapters to conduct specific operations as he might with Imperial Guard regiments. Instead, his staff worked to identify objectives where Space Marine capabilities would prove decisive and then requested chapter support for those operations. The chapters evaluated these requests according to their own priorities and available resources, accepting some missions while declining others. This arrangement frustrated Imperial Guard commanders who wanted to integrate Space Marine forces more fully into their operational planning, but the Astartes refused to compromise their independence or subordinate their forces to non-Astartes command. Decapitation strikes against enemy leadership represented one category of operation where Space Marine intervention proved consistently effective. The elimination of high-value chaos targets required capabilities that conventional forces often lacked, as enemy commanders typically surrounded themselves with elite bodyguards and fortified their headquarters against assault. Space Marines possess the combat power to fight through such defenses and the tactical flexibility to adapt when situations developed in unexpected ways. Multiple operations throughout the Crusade saw small Space Marine forces infiltrate enemy territory, eliminate key commanders or sorcerers, and withdraw before enemy forces could mount effective responses. The assassination of Chaos Commander Urient's Nakad on the world of Lyubov demonstrated this approach. Nakad had been directing enemy operations across an entire sector from a command bunker buried deep beneath Lyubov's surface. Imperial intelligence located the facility, but calculated that a conventional assault would require committing at least 2 army groups and would likely result in catastrophic casualties even if successful. Instead, Crusade Command requested Space Marine intervention. A strike force from the Marines Errant chapter accepted the mission, inserting a squad via teleportarium directly into the bunker complex. The Marines Errant materialized in a flash of light and ozone smell in a corridor deep within the enemy facility, their teleport homers having guided them to within meters of their target. The Chaos Defenders reacted with commendable speed, but they faced Space Marines who had trained for exactly this type of close quarters combat in confined spaces. The Marines Errant advanced through the bunker, their bolters and combat blades clearing rooms with mechanical efficiency. Nakad died attempting to flee through a secret escape tunnel, a bolt round catching him between the shoulder blades and detonating his torso. The Marines Errant withdrew via the same teleportarium that had delivered them, leaving the bunker complex in chaos as subordinate commanders struggled to determine what had happened and who now held authority. The deployment of dreadnoughts to particularly difficult combat zones provided Imperial forces with armored support that exceeded what conventional vehicles could offer. These ancient warriors, their broken bodies entombed within armored sarcophagi and kept alive through arcane technology, brought centuries of combat experience to bear alongside weapon systems that could devastate enemy formations. The presence of a dreadnought on the battlefield often proved decisive, as their combination of durability and firepower allowed them to anchor defensive positions or spearhead assaults that would otherwise have stalled. The reverence that other Space Marines showed toward these venerable warriors extended to Imperial Guard soldiers who fought alongside them, with many guardsmen viewing dreadnoughts as living saints whose presence guaranteed the Emperor's favor. Chaplains attached to Space Marine forces in the Sabbat Worlds served dual roles as spiritual leaders and combat specialists. These warriors maintained the faith and fighting spirit of their battle brothers, while also wielding Crozius Arcanum that could shatter enemy armor and bones with equal ease. The chaplains' understanding of chaos, corruption, and demonic threats made them particularly valuable in operations against enemy sorcerers or in locations where warp taint ran strong. Their presence provided spiritual protection that complemented the physical protection offered by power armor, creating a defense in depth against the insidious corruption that permeated chaos-held territories. Apothecaries who accompanied Space Marine forces into combat performed the crucial function of recovering gene seed from fallen battle brothers, ensuring that the chapter's genetic legacy would continue even when individual warriors fell. The gene seed organs implanted in Space Marines represented irreplaceable resources, each one a link in a chain stretching back to the chapter's founding and ultimately to the Emperor himself. Apothecaries risked their own lives to reach fallen brothers and extract the precious organs before enemy action or environmental conditions could damage them beyond recovery. This duty took precedence over other battlefield considerations, with apothecaries sometimes withdrawing from combat to secure recovered gene seed rather than continuing to fight alongside their brothers. Librarians deployed to the Sabbat Worlds brought psychic capabilities that provided crucial advantages in combating chaos sorcery. These warrior psychers had been trained to use their powers in service to the Emperor, while resisting the corruption that claimed weaker-willed individuals who touched the warp. Their abilities allowed them to detect hidden enemies, shield their brothers from psychic attacks, and unleash devastating offensive powers against enemy forces. The presence of a librarian in a Space Marine force significantly enhanced its capability to operate in environments saturated with warp energy, as the librarian could sense and counter threats that would remain invisible to warriors who lacked psychic gifts. The strategic value of Space Marine intervention extended beyond immediate combat results. The psychological impact of Adeptus Astartes' presence affected both Imperial and enemy forces in ways that conventional military analysis struggled to quantify. Imperial Guard soldiers who fought alongside Space Marines gained confidence from seeing the Emperor's finest warriors committed to their battles, while enemy forces often experienced degraded morale when facing opponents they knew to be nearly invincible. This psychological dimension meant that even small numbers of Space Marines could influence battles disproportionate to their actual combat power, as their reputation preceded them and shaped how both sides approached engagements where they participated. The coordination between Space Marine forces and Titan legions represented another aspect of Astartes' operations in the Crusade. When both forces deployed to the same battlefield, they typically established liaison arrangements that allowed for tactical coordination while respecting each organization's autonomy. Space Marines might provide infantry support for Titan advances, clearing enemy anti-armor teams that threatened the massive war machines, while Titans provided fire support that allowed Space Marines to advance against positions that would otherwise have required prohibitive casualties to assault. These cooperative arrangements worked best when commanders from both forces possessed mutual respect and understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations. The Siege of Vergast on Verghast represented a watershed moment in the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, demonstrating that Imperial resolve could withstand sustained chaos assault even when circumstances seemed most desperate. Verghast itself consisted of two massive hive cities, Vergast and Pharazoica, separated by vast ash wastes that covered much of the planet's surface. The world had maintained loyalty to the Imperium throughout the initial Chaos invasion, its hive militias and planetary defense forces repelling early enemy probes through determined resistance. However, by 768, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. Pharazoica had fallen to internal corruption, its ruling class having secretly pledged allegiance to the ruinous powers years before open conflict began. The corrupted hive turned its weapons against Vervenhive, initiating a civil war that threatened to deliver the entire planet to chaos control. Vervenhive's position became increasingly precarious as Pharazoica forces besieged the Loyalist hive. The attacking forces included not just corrupted militia units, but also substantial contingents of Blood Pact troops that had been covertly infiltrated into Pharazoica over preceding months. These elite Chaos warriors brought combat experience and fanaticism that the Hive militia defenders struggled to match. The siege lines crept closer to Vervenhive's outer walls as defenders exhausted their ammunition reserves and casualties mounted beyond what the Hive's medical facilities could adequately treat. Food supplies dwindled as the siege cut off trade routes, forcing rationing that left the civilian population weakening from hunger. The Vervenhive command structure sent increasingly desperate requests for Imperial intervention, warning that without relief, the Hive would fall within months. Warmaster Macaroth recognized the strategic importance of maintaining Imperial control over Verghast. The world's industrial capacity, while modest compared to major Forge worlds, still contributed meaningfully to Crusade logistics. More importantly, allowing a Loyalist hive to fall after months of determined resistance would send a devastating message about the Imperium's willingness to support worlds that remained faithful. Macaroth authorized the deployment of substantial forces to break the siege, including elements from multiple Imperial Guard regiments and significant Navy assets to ensure orbital supremacy during relief operations. The Tanith first arrived at Verghast as part of the relief force, their transport ships navigating through system space that showed signs of recent combat. Debris from destroyed vessels drifted in orbital paths, testament to the void battles that had preceded the ground campaign. Colonel Commissar Gaunt received his briefing from Fleet Command while still aboard the transport, learning that the relief operation would involve multiple simultaneous actions designed to overwhelm Pharazoica's siege forces and open supply corridors to the besieged hive. The Tanith would deploy to the ash wastes between the two hives, tasked with conducting reconnaissance and harassment operations against enemy supply lines, while conventional forces assaulted the main siege positions. The ash wastes proved to be terrain unlike anything most Tanith soldiers had encountered in previous campaigns. The landscape consisted of gray-black volcanic ash that extended to the horizon in all directions, broken only by occasional rocky outcroppings, and the skeletal remains of industrial structures that had been abandoned centuries earlier. The ash itself possessed a fine, powdery consistency that infiltrated equipment and clothing despite all attempts at sealing. Visibility varied wildly depending on wind conditions, with calm periods allowing sight lines of several kilometers, while sudden ash storms reduced visibility to mere meters. The Tanith adapted their movement techniques to the new environment, learning to read the subtle variations in ash depth and consistency that indicated safe paths versus areas where the ash concealed dangerous crevasses or unstable ground. The enemy forces operating in the ash wastes consisted primarily of raiding parties sent out from Pharazoica to interdict any relief attempts and maintain pressure on Vervenhive's outer defenses. These raiders knew the terrain intimately, having operated in the wastes for months before Imperial relief forces arrived. They employed hit-and-run tactics, striking at Imperial patrols before disappearing into the ash storms that periodically swept across the landscape. The Tanith found themselves engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, hunting enemy raiders while simultaneously avoiding becoming targets themselves. The regiment's woodcraft skills translated surprisingly well to the ash waste environment, with veterans learning to track enemy movements through disturbed ash patterns and other subtle signs that less observant soldiers would miss. The main Imperial assault on Pharazoica's siege positions began with sustained artillery bombardment from guns that had been laboriously transported across the ash wastes and emplaced within range of enemy fortifications. The bombardment lasted for 3 days, the constant thunder of guns audible even in Verghast dozens of kilometers away. Chaos forces responded with their own artillery, and the counter-battery duels resulted in significant casualties on both sides as gun crews worked to service their weapons while under fire. The Valpun Bluebloods, an Imperial Guard regiment known for their discipline and equipment quality, led the ground assault when the bombardment lifted. They advanced in textbook formation, their officers maintaining unit cohesion despite the murderous fire that enemy defenders poured into their ranks. The fighting at the siege lines demonstrated combined arms doctrine at both its most effective and most brutal. Imperial armor supported the infantry advance, Leman Russ battle tanks and Chimera transports providing mobile firepower and protected transport for assault troops. The tanks churned through the ash, their tracks throwing up clouds that provided concealment for following infantry. Chaos defenders had prepared anti-armor positions, and the advance cost the Imperials numerous vehicles to hidden las cannons and missile launchers. When tanks were hit, they often brewed up spectacularly, their ammunition stores detonating and sending flames, shooting dozens of meters into the air. Infantry squads learned to avoid following too closely behind armor, as destroyed tanks became obstacles that channeled movement into killing zones that enemy gunners had pre-registered. The Verghast defenders launched their own breakout assault to coincide with the Imperial Relief Forces' attack, attempting to catch the besiegers between two fires. The Hive militia that conducted this breakout had been reduced to shadows of their former strength through months of constant fighting and inadequate supplies. Many soldiers carried weapons scavenged from fallen comrades, and ammunition shortages meant that some units went into battle with only partially loaded magazines. Despite these handicaps, the defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that this represented their last chance to break the siege before starvation and ammunition exhaustion rendered further resistance impossible. The breakout achieved initial success, overwhelming forward chaos positions through sheer determination, but stalled when it encountered prepared defensive positions further from the hive walls. The coordination between the relief force, the breakout assault, and the Tanith operations in the ash wastes required communication systems that functioned reliably despite interference from ash storms and deliberate enemy jamming. Vox operators worked continuously to maintain contact between different Imperial forces, often resorting to pre-arranged signal protocols when direct communication proved impossible. The breakdown of communications at critical moments led to missed opportunities and friendly fire incidents, as units operating in the same area failed to recognize each other through the ash-choked air. One particularly tragic incident saw a Verghast militia unit engage Imperial Guard troops they mistook for enemy forces, the brief firefight resulting in casualties on both sides before officers managed to establish contact and cease fire. The siege broke after 2 weeks of sustained combat that left both sides exhausted and depleted. Pharozoica forces withdrew toward their hive, abandoning siege positions that had become untenable once Imperial forces established fire superiority and secured supply routes to Verghast. The relief of the Loyalist hive marked a significant propaganda victory for the Crusade, demonstrating that Imperial forces would fight to preserve worlds that maintained their faith in the Emperor. However, the strategic situation on Verghast remained unresolved, as Pharozoica continued to host substantial chaos forces, and the planet remained divided between loyalist and traitor populations. The campaign would continue for years afterward, consuming resources and attention that might have been directed toward operations on other worlds. The Jarian operation evolved from a focused special forces mission into a protracted nightmare that consumed years and cost hundreds of lives. Colonel Commissar Gaunt's infiltration team had been scattered during the disastrous insertion, and the survivors spent months simply trying to regroup while avoiding chaos security forces that hunted them across the corrupted world. The teams that did manage to reunite found themselves operating in an environment so thoroughly tainted by chaos that normal operational procedures became inadequate. The very air on Geryon carried a sickly quality that made breathing uncomfortable, and prolonged exposure to the planet's atmosphere seemed to induce subtle psychological changes in those who remained too long. The resistance networks that Gaunt's forces eventually contacted operated under conditions that made conventional insurgency nearly impossible. Chaos authorities on Geryon had implemented surveillance systems that monitored civilian populations with thoroughness that approached paranoia. Citizens required authorization documents to move between districts, and random security checkpoints detained anyone whose papers showed irregularities or whose appearance triggered suspicion. The resistance fighters had adapted by fragmenting into tiny cells that maintained minimal contact with each other, sacrificing operational effectiveness for survival. Information sharing between cells occurred through dead drops and coded messages that took days or weeks to transmit, making coordinated action extremely difficult to organize. The extraction operation that eventually pulled Imperial forces off Geryon represented one of the most complex special operations undertaken during the entire Crusade. Planning for the extraction consumed months as Crusade Command worked to develop methods for locating and recovering personnel scattered across an enemy-held world where normal communication proved impossible. The Navy contributed specialized stealth ships equipped with enhanced sensors and insertion craft designed for covert planetary approaches. Intelligence services recruited informants among Geryon's population, bribing or blackmailing individuals who had access to information about Imperial resistance activities. The operation ultimately succeeded in recovering approximately 40% of the personnel who had been inserted during the original mission, with the remainder either killed in action, captured by Chaos forces, or simply lost in the corrupted landscape. The survivors who returned from Geryon carried psychological scars that marked them as fundamentally changed by their experiences. Medical personnel who examined the returnees noted symptoms consistent with prolonged warp exposure, including recurring nightmares, difficulty concentrating, and episodes of dissociation. Some individuals reported memories of events that could not possibly have occurred, suggesting that the corrupted environment on Geryon had affected their perceptions in ways that went beyond simple stress or trauma. The Inquisition took interest in several cases where returnees displayed knowledge or abilities they should not have possessed, conducting extensive debriefings, and in some cases ordering individuals placed under permanent observation to monitor for signs of corruption. The campaigns on Herodor and the defense of Shrine Worlds represented battles fought as much for symbolic value as strategic necessity. Herodor had been designated a Shrine World in recognition of Saint Sabbat's visit during her ancient pilgrimage, and the ecclesiarchy had invested enormous resources in constructing temples and religious monuments across the planet's surface. The world's population embraced their role as guardians of sacred sites, with generations of families dedicating themselves to maintaining the shrines and serving the pilgrims who traveled from across the sector to walk in the saints' footsteps. When Chaos forces launched their assault on Herodor in 773, they attacked not just a military target, but a symbol of Imperial faith that resonated throughout the entire Sabbat Worlds region. The Sons of Sec forces that conducted the Herodor assault demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded what Imperial commanders had anticipated. The initial attacks targeted the planet's orbital defenses and spaceports, destroying or capturing facilities that would be necessary for Imperial reinforcement efforts. Simultaneously, infiltration teams that had been covertly positioned on Herodor over preceding months emerged to conduct sabotage operations against ground-based defenses and communication networks. The coordination between these different elements suggested extensive planning and intelligence gathering, indicating that Anaquener Sec had identified Herodor as a priority target well in advance of launching the operation. The defense of Herodor's primary shrine complex demonstrated the determination of forces fighting to protect sites they considered sacred. The shrine defenders included both regular Imperial Guard units and local militia forces, augmented by members of the ecclesiarchy's militant orders. These defenders established positions within and around the shrine buildings, turning sacred spaces into fortified strongpoints. The Chaos attackers showed no hesitation about directing fire at religious structures, their weapons reducing ancient temples to rubble as they advanced. The fighting within the shrine complex became particularly brutal, with combatants engaging in close quarters, battle through corridors decorated with religious iconography and chambers where pilgrims had once gathered for prayer. Blood-stained floors that had been consecrated through centuries of devotional use, and the bodies of defenders and attackers alike lay among shattered statues of imperial saints. The fall of Herodor sent shock waves through imperial forces across the Crusade theater. The ecclesiarchy declared the loss a catastrophe that demanded immediate response, with senior clerics calling for the commitment of whatever forces proved necessary to reclaim the shrine world. Warmaster Macaroth faced intense pressure to authorize a major counteroffensive, but strategic realities complicated any such operation. Herodor's position deep within territory that Chaos forces now controlled meant that relief operations would require fighting through multiple defensive lines and maintaining extended supply routes through hostile space. The forces necessary for such an operation would need to be drawn from other sectors, potentially creating vulnerabilities elsewhere that enemy commanders might exploit. The campaigns on Ancrian Sextus demonstrated how critical engagements could shift momentum through the capture of key strategic positions rather than the destruction of major enemy forces. Ancrian Sextus occupied a position along one of the primary warp routes through the Sabbat Worlds, making it a natural choke point for both military and commercial traffic. Chaos forces had fortified the system extensively, establishing orbital platforms and ground installations that could interdict Imperial shipping and threaten any forces attempting to transit the region. Imperial planners identified Ancrian Sextus as a necessary objective for any sustained push deeper into enemy-held territory, as leaving the system under Chaos control would leave supply lines vulnerable and limit operational flexibility. The assault on Ancrian Sextus began with an extended void battle as Battle Fleet Sabbat engaged the orbital defenses and enemy fleet elements protecting the system. The Navy committed substantial forces to the operation, including multiple battleships and cruiser squadrons that hammered enemy positions with sustained bombardment. The Chaos defenders fought with determination that suggested they understood the system's strategic value, their ships conducting aggressive counterattacks rather than simply defending fixed positions. The Void battle consumed weeks of sustained combat, with both sides suffering significant losses before Imperial forces finally secured orbital supremacy sufficient to begin ground operations. The ground campaign on Ancrian Sextus involved fighting across multiple worlds and moons within the system, each hosting defensive installations that required individual assault operations. The main world featured extensive fortifications built into mountainous terrain that provided natural defensive advantages. Imperial forces conducting the ground assault found themselves fighting uphill against defenders who had established positions on high ground and prepared fields of fire that covered likely approach routes. Artillery proved crucial in reducing these positions, with Imperial guns conducting careful shoots to collapse bunkers and destroy weapon emplacements, without causing excessive collateral damage to infrastructure that would be valuable once the system came under Imperial control. The campaigns on Fantine represented warfare conducted in an environment that challenged conventional tactical doctrine. Fantine consisted of floating cities suspended in the planet's atmosphere by ancient technology that even the Adeptus Mechanicus could not fully explain. The cities drifted through the upper atmosphere on currents that followed predictable but complex patterns, occasionally coming close enough to each other for physical connection, but more often remaining separated by kilometers of open air. The population had adapted to this environment over generations, developing vehicles and equipment suited to aerial operations, and maintaining their civilization in defiance of the hostile surface far below. The Fantine campaign required Imperial forces to conduct operations in three-dimensional space rather than the conventional two-dimensional battlefield that characterized most ground warfare. Infantry units deployed via aircraft that could match speed with the floating cities, conducting boarding actions that resembled naval operations more than traditional ground assault. The Fantine skyborne regiments that joined the Crusade brought expertise in aerial warfare that proved invaluable, their soldiers accustomed to fighting while suspended hundreds of meters above the planet's surface. These regiments employed tactics that emphasized vertical envelopment and the seizure of key structures within floating cities, rather than the linear advances typical of conventional ground forces. The defense of supply convoys traveling between Fantine's floating cities became a continuous operation that consumed significant resources throughout the campaign. Chaos forces employed aircraft to intercept these convoys, attacking from multiple directions and using the three-dimensional nature of the battlefield to complicate defensive responses. Imperial escort forces learned to maintain formation around convoy vessels while watching for threats from above, below, and all horizontal directions simultaneously. The loss of a supply convoy could doom an entire floating city to starvation or ammunition exhaustion, making convoy protection a critical mission that received priority for air defense assets and fighter cover. The Sabbat Worlds Crusade entered its fourth decade in the late 41st millennium, having consumed resources and lives on a scale that staggered even by the Imperium standards of acceptable loss. The official tallies maintained by the Adeptus Munitorum recorded over 70 million Imperial Guard casualties across hundreds of regiments, though these figures represented only confirmed deaths and did not account for soldiers missing in action, those who had deserted and disappeared into the chaos of war-torn worlds, or the countless wounded who had been discharged from service. The Navy had lost over 300 capital ships destroyed outright, with hundreds more damaged severely enough to require years of repair work in distant shipyards. The economic cost measured in the trillions of thrones, representing not just military expenditure, but also the opportunity cost of resources that might have been deployed elsewhere across the Imperium's embattled territories. Against these staggering losses, the Crusade could point to genuine territorial gains. Imperial forces had liberated or secured control over approximately 60% of the star systems that comprised the Sabbat Worlds cluster. The reclaimed Forge world of Urdesh operated at roughly 40% of its pre-invasion industrial capacity, producing ammunition, vehicles, and equipment that reduced the Crusade's dependence on supply lines stretching back to distant sectors. Balhaut served as a functioning military headquarters and logistics hub, its orbital facilities capable of supporting fleet operations throughout the region. Dozens of other worlds had been brought back under Imperial authority, their populations theoretically restored to proper worship of the Emperor, and their resources directed towards supporting continued military operations. The reality of these liberated worlds proved considerably more complicated than official reports suggested. The process of reconstruction on worlds that had spent years or decades under chaos occupation required addressing damage that went far beyond simple physical destruction. Infrastructure that had been corrupted through deliberate chaos taint could not simply be repaired, but needed to be completely demolished and rebuilt from foundations up. The Adeptus Mechanicus insisted on conducting extensive purification rituals before declaring any restored facility safe for operation, procedures that consumed months or years depending on the severity of corruption detected. Civilian populations that had been exposed to chaos influence required spiritual reconquest through intensive re-education programs administered by the ecclesiarchy, efforts that met resistance from individuals who had adapted to life under enemy occupation and viewed imperial authority with suspicion or hostility. The resettlement of populations displaced by the war-created administrative challenges that strained the capacity of imperial bureaucracies already struggling to manage the Crusade's military operations. Millions of refugees had fled worlds during chaos invasions or imperial liberation campaigns, congregating in temporary camps on worlds that lacked the infrastructure to support them long-term. The Administratum worked to identify suitable destinations for these displaced populations, attempting to match refugees with worlds that needed labor to rebuild damaged infrastructure or expand agricultural production. The resettlement process moved with glacial slowness, hampered by the logistical difficulties of transporting millions of people across interstellar distances and the reluctance of many planetary governors to accept refugees they viewed as potential security risks or economic burdens. The re-establishment of imperial authority on liberated worlds involved rebuilding governance structures that chaos occupation had destroyed or corrupted. The Administratum dispatched teams of officials to conduct censuses, establish tax collection systems, and implement the countless regulations that governed life within the Imperium. Local populations that had lived for years without imperial oversight often resisted these efforts, viewing the returning bureaucrats as unwelcome intruders imposing arbitrary rules on communities that had developed their own survival mechanisms during the occupation. The Arbites enforced compliance through methods that ranged from administrative penalties to public executions, creating resentment that complicated efforts to win genuine loyalty from populations that official records listed as liberated. The strategic implications of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade extended far beyond the immediate region, influencing imperial military planning throughout the Segmentum Pacificus. The commitment of such massive forces to a single campaign theater for decades had drawn resources away from other potential trouble spots, creating situations where threats that might have been addressed early instead festered and grew. The Administratum calculated that the forces tied down in the Sabbat Worlds could have fought dozens of smaller campaigns across multiple sectors, potentially preventing other regions from falling to various threats. This opportunity cost generated ongoing debate among imperial strategists about whether the Crusade represented effective resource allocation or a strategic mistake that had allowed problems elsewhere to metastasize. The defensive posture of the Imperium in the Segmentum Pacificus had been fundamentally altered by the Sabbat Worlds campaign. The region that had once represented a relatively stable part of imperial space had become a contested frontier where chaos forces maintained substantial presence and continued to threaten nearby systems. The Imperial Navy had been forced to establish permanent patrol routes and rapid response forces throughout the sector, diverting vessels from other duties to maintain security along trade routes and defend against raiding operations. The strategic reserve forces that would normally be available for deployment to emerging threats had been depleted through the Crusade's sustained personnel requirements, leaving Sector Command with limited flexibility to respond to new crises. Chaos forces under Anaquener Sec's command continued to hold significant portions of the Sabbat Worlds despite decades of Imperial offensive operations. The Sons of Sec had proven themselves capable of conducting sophisticated defensive operations, establishing fortified positions on key worlds and maintaining supply networks that sustained their forces despite Imperial interdiction efforts. Sec himself remained at large, his exact location unknown to Imperial intelligence, despite extensive efforts to locate and eliminate him. The Chaos Commander had demonstrated strategic acumen comparable to the Imperial Warmasters who opposed him, making decisions that maximized his force's effectiveness while minimizing exposure to Imperial counterattacks. The Forge world of Naistan remained under Chaos control, its manufactoria continuing to produce weapons and equipment for enemy forces throughout the region. Multiple Imperial operations aimed at capturing or neutralizing Naistan had been proposed over the years, but the world's formidable defenses and strategic depth within enemy-held territory had prevented any from being authorized. The existence of a functioning Chaos industrial base within the Sabbat Worlds meant that enemy forces could replace losses and maintain operations without depending entirely on supply lines vulnerable to Imperial interdiction. Intelligence reports suggested that Naiston's output had actually increased during the later years of the Crusade, as Chaos authorities implemented more efficient production methods and expanded existing facilities. The Blood Pact continued to represent the most formidable conventional military force opposing Imperial armies in the region. Despite the death of Archon Gower at Balhaut decades earlier, the Blood Pact maintained its organizational cohesion and combat effectiveness through the religious devotion that bound its members to Khorne. New recruits continued to undergo the blood-binding rituals that created warriors willing to fight to the death in service to the Blood God. Imperial forces that encountered Blood Pact units in the late Crusade period reported that these troops fought with undiminished fanaticism, suggesting that whatever command structure had emerged after Gower's death had successfully maintained the organization's martial culture and training standards. The Sons of Sek and Blood Pact forces occasionally clashed with each other over territorial disputes or conflicting objectives, creating situations where Imperial forces could potentially exploit divisions within the enemy coalition. However, attempts to capitalize on these internal chaos conflicts proved disappointing, as both organizations demonstrated willingness to set aside their differences when facing Imperial threats. The rivalry between the two factions seemed to motivate each to demonstrate superior combat effectiveness rather than weakening their overall military capability. Some Imperial analysts suggested that the competition actually enhanced enemy performance by creating pressure to achieve victories that would establish dominance within the Chaos hierarchy. The ongoing insurgency on supposedly liberated worlds consumed substantial Imperial military resources that might otherwise have been directed toward offensive operations against remaining Chaos strongholds. Garrison forces assigned to pacification duties found themselves engaged in continuous low-intensity combat against cult cells that emerged from hiding to conduct attacks before disappearing back into civilian populations. The tactics employed by these insurgents evolved over time as they learned from failed operations and adapted to Imperial counter-insurgency methods. Improvised explosive devices became increasingly sophisticated, targeting Imperial patrols and convoys with weapons constructed from scavenged military ordnance or materials diverted from reconstruction projects. Assassination attempts against Imperial officials and collaborators created an atmosphere of paranoia that hindered governance efforts and discouraged cooperation with Imperial authorities. The Inquisition maintained substantial presence throughout the Sabbat Worlds, its agents conducting investigations into suspected Chaos corruption and monitoring populations for signs of heretical belief. Inquisitors operated with authority that superseded normal military or civilian hierarchies, requisitioning resources and personnel as they deemed necessary for their investigations. The methods employed by some Inquisitors generated friction with Crusade military commanders who found their operations disrupted by investigations that pulled key personnel away from their duties or declared entire units suspect based on evidence that the commanders considered insufficient. The balance between maintaining security against Chaos infiltration and preserving operational effectiveness remained a persistent source of tension throughout the later Crusade period. The Ecclesiarchy's efforts to achieve spiritual reconquest of the Sabbat Worlds faced challenges that went beyond simple logistics or resource limitations. Populations that had lived under Chaos occupation for extended periods had been exposed to beliefs and practices that contradicted fundamental Imperial doctrine. Some individuals had participated in heretical rituals under coercion, but retained memories and knowledge that marked them as corrupted in the eyes of Ecclesiarchy authorities. Others had genuinely converted to Chaos worship and maintained their heretical beliefs even after Imperial liberation, practicing their forbidden faith in secret while outwardly conforming to Imperial religious requirements. The Ecclesiarchy's response involved mass purges of suspected heretics, public burnings of individuals deemed beyond redemption, and mandatory re-education programs for populations considered salvageable. These harsh measures achieved compliance in many cases, but also generated resentment and drove some individuals toward active resistance against imperial authority. The strategic stalemate that characterized the Crusades' later years frustrated imperial commanders who had expected decisive victory within a reasonable timeframe. The initial momentum of the Slaydo years had given way to grinding attritional warfare, where neither side possessed the strength to achieve breakthrough victories that would fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Imperial forces could capture individual worlds through sustained operations that committed overwhelming force to specific objectives, but lacked the resources to conduct multiple such operations simultaneously across the entire theater. Chaos forces could launch counteroffensives that reclaimed some lost territory, but could not muster the strength necessary to threaten major imperial positions like Balhaut or Urdesh. The result was a military situation that resembled trench warfare on a galactic scale, with front lines that shifted incrementally over years rather than moving decisively in either direction. The toll on veteran regiments that had fought throughout the Crusade manifested in ways that went beyond simple casualty figures. Units that had deployed to the Sabbat Worlds in the campaign's early years had been reduced to fractions of their original strength through decades of sustained combat. The Tanith First, which had begun the Crusade with approximately 3,000 men, numbered fewer than 800 by the late 41st Millennium, despite receiving replacements from recruiting efforts on liberated worlds. The regiment's character had changed as Tanith-born soldiers died and were replaced by recruits who had never seen the destroyed homeworld that gave the unit its identity. Similar patterns affected other long-service regiments, creating forces that bore little resemblance to the units that had originally deployed decades earlier. The Navy faced its own sustainability challenges as decades of continuous operations degraded vessels and exhausted crews. Ships that had been state-of-the-art when the Crusade began were now outdated compared to newer designs being constructed in distant shipyards. Yet the Navy could not afford to withdraw them from service for the extensive refits that would be required to bring them up to current standards. Crews that had spent years or even decades on deployment in the Sabbat Worlds showed signs of declining effectiveness, with fatigue and declining morale affecting performance in ways that training and discipline could not entirely compensate for. The rotation of vessels and personnel back to home ports for rest and refit proceeded slowly, constrained by the need to maintain sufficient forces in theater to execute ongoing operations and respond to enemy threats. The political situation on Terra regarding the Crusade's continuation remained contentious throughout the late 41st Millennium. Some factions within the High Lords of Terra argued for committing additional resources to achieve decisive victory, viewing the Sabbat Worlds as a test of imperial resolve that could not be abandoned without severe consequences for imperial authority throughout the segmentum. Others advocated for scaling back operations to a sustainable level that would maintain imperial control over liberated territory, while accepting that complete conquest of the region might require generations to achieve. The competing pressures resulted in a compromise approach where the Crusade continued, but without the massive resource commitments that had characterized its early years, creating a situation where operations proceeded at reduced tempo without clear timeline for ultimate resolution. Warmaster Macaroth remained in command of the Crusade into the late 41st Millennium, his tenure having lasted far longer than anyone had anticipated when he assumed the position after Slaydo's death. The Warmaster had aged visibly under the burden of command, his hair gone completely gray and his face lined with stress from decades of managing a campaign that consumed lives and resources without producing the decisive victory that would justify such sacrifices. Macaroth's strategic approach had evolved over the years, becoming more cautious as he recognized the limitations of available forces and the resilience of enemy opposition. Critics continued to argue that more aggressive leadership might have achieved better results, while supporters maintained that Macaroth's careful management had prevented catastrophic defeats that could have lost everything the Crusade had gained. The eternal vigilance required to maintain imperial control in the Sabbat Worlds had become a permanent feature of life in the region, rather than a temporary military necessity. The Crusade had transformed from a campaign with defined objectives and anticipated conclusion into an ongoing military commitment that showed no signs of ending. Garrison forces on liberated worlds understood that their deployments would likely last for years or decades, with rotation back to home worlds becoming increasingly uncertain as the strategic situation demanded maintaining force levels throughout the theater. The civilian populations on these worlds lived under martial law that showed no indication of being lifted, with military authorities maintaining emergency powers that superseded normal governance structures indefinitely. The legacy of Saint Sabbat herself became increasingly important to imperial propaganda efforts as the Crusade ground on without resolution. The ecclesiarchy emphasized the saint's ancient prophecies about the region, interpreting them as promises that imperial faith would ultimately triumph over chaos corruption, regardless of how long the struggle required. Shrines dedicated to Saint Sabbat on liberated worlds became focal points for religious devotion, with pilgrims traveling from across the sector to pray at sites associated with the saint's ancient pilgrimage. The ecclesiarchy organized massive public ceremonies on significant anniversaries, using these events to reinforce imperial ideology and maintain morale among populations exhausted by decades of war. The saint's Beatty, living individuals believed to carry her blessing, appeared at critical moments throughout the later Crusade, their presence interpreted as signs of divine favor that encouraged continued resistance against chaos forces. The Sabbat Worlds Crusade stood as testament to both imperial determination and the limitations of that determination when confronting threats that could not be eliminated through simple application of military force. The campaign had achieved significant objectives, reclaiming dozens of worlds and destroying substantial chaos military forces, but it had also demonstrated that reconquest alone could not restore what had been lost to chaos corruption. The worlds brought back under imperial control remained scarred by their experiences, their populations traumatized, and their infrastructure damaged in ways that would take generations to fully repair. The chaos forces that continued to resist imperial authority showed no signs of accepting defeat, their faith in the ruinous powers providing motivation that matched or exceeded the imperial faith that sustained their opponents. As the 41st millennium drew toward its close, the Sabbat Worlds remained a contested region where the Imperium maintained precarious control through continuous military effort. The crusade that had begun with promises of swift victory and complete liberation had become a generational struggle whose resolution remained uncertain. The forces committed to the campaign could not be withdrawn without abandoning hard-won gains and betraying the millions who had died to achieve them, yet continuing operations at current levels strained imperial resources and diverted attention from other threats emerging across the galaxy. The Sabbat Worlds Crusade had become, in many ways, a microcosm of the Imperium itself in the late 41st millennium, embattled, determined, grinding forward through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat, yet unable to achieve the decisive victories that would bring genuine security. The eternal war continued, as it always had and always would, until the Emperor himself should rise from the Golden Throne to lead humanity to final victory or ultimate destruction.